Pursuant to notice, this hearing on the state of religious freedom around the world will come to order. We are gathered, and I want to thank all of our distinguished witnesses for joining us today and all of the members of the House for being here to further explore the state of religious freedom around the world, coinciding with the non-governmental International Religious Freedom Summit that began today at the Omni Shoreham Hotel here in Washington, D.C. Shockingly, as it prepares to host the 2022 Winter Olympic Games, China's leader Xi Jinping is committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslims and other minorities in Xinjiang. Xinjiang's genocide includes the forced disappearances of millions of Uyghurs into concentration camps, the forced sterilization of Uyghur women, the forced abortion of their children, unbelievable torture against individuals, particularly in those concentration camps, and of course, the abduction of Uyghur children into orphanages, far from their home, to be reared with non-Uyghur upbringing while their parents are being mistreated. The Chinese Communist Party is today systematically erasing Islam in Western China, bulldozing mosques and shrines, severely throttling all religious practice and forcing camp detainees to renounce their faith. Leaked documents published by the New York Times quote Xi Jinping shamelessly pushing his genocide, saying, "Show no mercy." Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party have also exponentially increased persecution against all other religious believers, including Christians, Tibetan Buddhists, Falun Gong practitioners, and others, in ways that have not been seen since the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping's apparently fearing the power of independent religious belief as a challenge to the Communist Party's absolute dominance is trying to either destroy or radically transform religion into the party's servant, employing a draconian policy known as synodization that seeks to subjugate or eliminate any faith or belief that competes with Chinese communism. Virtually all of China is affected. Those under the age of 18 cannot perform many religious functions or receive religious schooling. Sacred texts like the Bible are under assault as Chinese officials scramble to rewrite them. And then there's the utter cruelty. I would like to call attention to one of our witnesses, particularly Gulzira Alyakhan, a Kazakh Muslim who will be giving compelling eyewitness testimony on the use of tiger chairs, horrific instruments of torture against Uyghurs and Kazakh detainees, as well as the systematic rape of Uyghur women by Chinese authorities. As my colleagues know, religious freedom is under siege all over the world. 2 decades ago, the great Jewish human rights leader and former political prisoner in the Soviet Union, Natan Sharansky, testified at one of my congressional hearings on combating anti-Semitism. And he said, quote, "There are 2 important components in this new phenomenon of anti-Semitism. One is using an old anti-Israeli campaign for strengthening anti-Semitism, and the other is classical anti-Semitism, the old, deep, primitive prejudices against Jews." Mr. Sharansky proposed a simple formula for exposing anti-Semitism, masquerading as mere policy differences with the nation of Israel. And he called it the 3D test: demonization, double standard, and delegitimization. All 3 manifestations of anti-Semitic hate are on full display today as violence against Jews erupts on American streets and throughout the world. According to the FBI, more than 60% of all all anti-religious hate crimes in the United States are directed against Jews. So our words indeed must be clear. We must absolutely reject anti-Semitism in all of its ugly forms. In Nigeria, we see a country which on paper has robust legal protections for all religions, but in practice is now a country where many religious and ethnic groups perceive themselves as under serious threat. While much attention is focused on extremist terrorist group by Salafist groups like Boko Haram and breakaway factions such as the Islamic State, West Africa, or Ansaru against those they consider infidels, that is not the only threat, nor is it climate change or farmer-herder conflict, a popular narrative favored by the State Department and certain academics, but a narrative which is woefully incomplete. Rather, the principal threat comes from Fulani ethno-religious supremacism, which has been actively encouraged and abetted by the current administration of President Buhari. It's important to note that this cannot be labeled strictly a Muslim-Christian conflict, though Christians, particularly in the middle belt of Nigeria, are often targeted by Fulani Muslim extremists. But so too are Shia Muslims, however, as well as ethnic Yoruba, who can be either Muslim or Christians, and often have families where interreligious marriage is commonplace. What we are seeing unfold in Nigeria under President Buhari is the deliberate Fulanization of Nigerian institutions. This can be seen, for example, in the sacking of the Chief Justice of the Nigerian Supreme Court, Walter Onegan, and his replacement by Ibrahim Mohammed. You'll also be seeing that the key positions, key in military and security, are occupied now by Fulani, and that wasn't the case with previous administrations in Nigeria. Nor is this a new agenda. If you speak with Nigerians or listen to what Fulani say in Fulford or Hausra, you will hear express the desire to fulfill the jihadist ambitions of Usman Dan Fodio, who in the late 18th and early 19th century sought to spread Islam to the sea under the Fulani spear, displacing and subjugating the far older Kanuri-dominated Islamic political order. As goes Nigeria, so goes all of West Africa, underscoring the importance of respect for ethnic and religious pluralism in this critically important African nation. I think it's also important to underscore the fact that the single most persecuted religious group in the world is Christians, and that often these persecuted Christians come from mostly economically downtrodden and marginalized classes. This was noted in a report 2 years ago under the direction of British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt, who fingered secular political correctness as creating an awkward inability to speak about the persecution of Christians. In his words, and I quote, "What we have forgotten is that atmosphere of political correctness is actually the Christians are being persecuted are some of the poorest people on the planet, i.e. the Dalits in India. In Iran and Pakistan, we see a different model of religious persecution, where religious minorities are singled out for their nonconformity with the dominant religion. Iran's authoritarian government uses its constitution and raw power to mete out punishments for practicing the very rights it should protect. In October, the International Foundation for Human Rights found that the, quote, death penalty has often been used against members of Iran's ethnic communities and religious minorities, especially in political cases, based on the whole concept of spreading corruption on earth, insurrection, and other vaguely worded crimes. Last November, the homes of dozens of Baha'i were simultaneously raided. Several Sunni Muslim students and teachers were interrogated and arrested during Ramadan for their beliefs. Christians from historic churches are treated as second-class citizens, while Iranian converts from Islam to Christianity, many of whom are evangelical, are treated with greater severity. In Pakistan, which was designated a country of particular concern in December, state and non-state acts have continued to erode the religious freedom of minorities. Harsh blasphemy laws continue to be enforced against Shia and Ahmadi Muslims, as well as Christians, Pakistani Indians, Hindus, and who historically found the Sindh province to be more tolerant, or today being forced, actually, to migrate to escape persecution and marginalization. As the State Department noted in its 2020 International Religious Freedom Report, in far too many places, individuals continue to be killed, tortured, jailed, harassed, and threatened on account of their religious identity or beliefs. Left unaddressed, such abuses threaten social cohesion and political stability, undermine economic development, and can foster radicalization and violent extremism, close quote. The numerous tools at the United States' disposal must be wielded firmly against individual persecutors, especially the sanctions embedded in the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act and Global Magnitsky Act. Where moral suasion fails, the curtailment of access to countries and markets can incentivize real change. And above all, we need to engage in bilateral and multilateral conversations with countries and their actors. We cannot de-link human rights, in particular, religious freedom, from economic and security concerns. Our commitment to the fundamental human dignity of our neighbors must remain paramount. I'd like to now yield to my good friend and colleague, the co-chair of our Lantos Commission, Jim McGovern.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I join Co-Chair Smith in welcoming everyone to the Human Rights Commission hearing on the state of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion around the globe. I want to begin by remembering Father Stan Swami, an 84-year-old Jesuit priest who died in the custody of the Indian government on July 5th. May he rest in peace and power. Father Stan spent 5 decades fighting for the rights of the indigenous people known as Adivasis in what is now the state of Jharkhand in India. Last October, he was arrested and accused of having instigated an outbreak of caste-based violence. An independent analysis found that the evidence used to accuse him had been planted on a computer. But no matter. Investigators and courts ignored his bail request and kept him in jail. Even after he caught COVID, even though he could barely hold a glass of water due to his Parkinson's, until he died. In the aftermath of Father Stan's death, reports and condemnations of his treatment have poured in. All mentioned that he was a Jesuit priest. One said that he paid for being a true Christian. Another linked his death to purported efforts of the Hindu nationalist movement to force Christians out of India. Father Stan's case can be read as one of Christian persecution. But there's more to the story. Yes, Father Stan's faith played a role because that faith led him to devote his life to fighting for justice for the poor and the dispossessed. But the law under which he was charged is not about religion at all. Father Stan was arrested and held without trial for 9 months under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, India's draconian anti-terrorism law. The law has been widely criticized for targeting peaceful dissenters, human rights defenders, and journalists. A number of other people, including poets, lawyers, activists, and writers, were charged along with him. Father Stan's case is one example of how the right to freedom of religion intersects with other fundamental rights, the freedoms of speech and association, the right to equal protection under the law, the right to a fair and public hearing, the right to be presumed innocent, all of which are protected under international human rights law. Father Stan's death happened because all these rights, which the government of India is legally obligated to respect, protect, and fulfill, were violated. This is why it is so important to understand and foster the right to freedom of belief or religion in relationship to the full range of human rights, as some of our witnesses today will emphasize. There are a couple of other issues we will hear about this afternoon and that I want to highlight. First, all of us have a responsibility to make sure that our efforts to protect freedom of religion do not deepen conflict or exacerbate sectarian divides. One way that can happen is by attributing complex conflicts to religious differences when many other causes are also at play. Second, we need to ask ourselves how we decide which religions or which set of beliefs are deserving of recognition. Father Stan was fighting for the rights of indigenous peoples in India whose identity and culture are linked to the communal lands they were deprived of. In this hemisphere, we do not recognize the spiritual relationship that indigenous people have to land and nature as religious. As a result, we do not characterize the stealing of the project was launched, but our understanding of the role that as a result, we do not characterize the stealing of their land as a religious freedom issue. I believe that we need to rethink that. Mr. Chair, can I ask everybody to please put their to be on mute?
You're absolutely right, Jim. I'm on mute, and I hope everybody else will do the same.
Third, I want to draw your attention to the most recent report by the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. He urges us to pay attention to the ways that discrimination and exclusion on the grounds of identity, including religious identity, intersect with discrimination and access to essential services, resources, and opportunities. His report summarizes how denial of access to education, lack of security of land tenure, hunger, and the denial of legal identity affect religious communities, among others. The treatment of the Baha'i in Iran is an example of some of this. It's another reason we need to look at all rights as an integrated whole. I would like to close with a call for humility. As Americans, we think of ourselves as a beacon for freedom of religion. After all, it's the first freedom addressed in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But the First Amendment is one powerful sentence and it enumerates many of our most cherished rights: the freedom to exercise religion, the freedom of speech and of the press, the right to peaceably assemble, and the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. From the founding of our nation, freedom of religion was defined within the context of a body of interdependent rights. As a Catholic, I'm just old enough to remember the anti-Catholic discrimination that John F. Kennedy had to face during his presidential campaign. I'm sure we all remember that the last administration sought to ban entry to the United States for Muslims. Let's also remember that only 2 years ago, the Supreme Court denied the request of a death row inmate to be accompanied by his Muslim spiritual advisor as he was executed. And just this week, the Washington Post published an article about the desire of a new religious movement to replace the separation of church and state with a world in which their version of Christianity will control all spheres of life, including government, a theocratic vision, if you will. In light of our own history, perhaps it is time for Congress to mandate that the United States be included in annual analyses of the state of freedom of belief or religion around the world. We would learn from comparing U.S. practices with other countries, and it would send a strong message that we hold our own country to the same universal standards we expect others to uphold. So we're about to hear some very powerful testimony from the witnesses. Again, I thank them for being here, and I yield back.
Thank you very much to my co-chair. Very good statement. I would like to yield. Gus Bilirakis would like to give some opening comments, and maybe Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee would as well. But I would like to yield to Mr. Bilirakis such time as he may consider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much. I'm going to be very brief because I want to hear from the witnesses. So I want to thank my good friend, of course, Chris Smith, and also my friend Jim McGovern and for holding this hearing again today, especially considering the widespread threats to religious freedom around the world. The right to worship must be protected throughout the globe. No person should ever be intimidated, forced from their ancestral homeland, imprisoned, or murdered because of their religion. This has been something I've fought for my entire congressional career as the co-chair of the International Religious Freedom Caucus and as a member of the executive committee of this commission. And I had the pleasure of serving with Mr. Lantos. It was a wonderful, wonderful man. I look forward again to hearing the testimony from our distinguished panelists regarding the religious minorities I've fought for over the years, such as the Ahmadi in Pakistan, the Baha'i in Iran, the Christians in the Middle East, Christians and other religious minorities in Turkey and Nigeria, and the Uyghurs, of course, the Tibetans and Falun Gong practitioners in China. And I have a case right now with a constituent, a family member of my constituent is being detained because of his practice of Falun Gong in China, and we're trying to help him out. So, folks, thank you very much for putting an emphasis on this. It's so very important. And I'll go ahead and yield back. Look forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bilirakis, and thank you for your leadership, on religious freedom worldwide, but for the Orthodox in particular. You've done a tremendous job, particularly as Turkey has rained down so horribly on Cyprus and of course, Orthodox Christians and others in Turkey itself. So thank you, Mr. Bilirakis. I'd like to yield to Sheila Jackson Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and both chairmen. Thank you so very much for having, again, another important hearing. We realize that around the world, individuals have literally been killed, abused, brutalized, men and women, children. As my colleague, Mr. Bilirakis, has said, they've been pulled from their homeland. And they've done so sometimes with not the same indignation one would find for other abuses, maybe something called human rights, even though religious rights, as we know, having known the late Tom Lantos, is vital. And I thank you all for continuing his commitment and tradition under the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission on this very important issue. Religious beliefs are precious. They are sometimes a birthright. And according to the Pew Research Center, government restrictions on religion, ranging from the prohibition on worship or government harassment to violence against religious groups, have increased globally for over a decade. We are well aware of the hostage almost of the group in Iraq that were held on a mountain and could not get down based on their religion. We know of the Uyghurs who had been a constant face to that. But I also know, as a co-chair of the Nigerian caucus, and I'm glad that both China and Nigeria will be represented here today, of the abuse against Christians in Nigeria, particularly the northern region. The Chibok girls that were kidnapped. Some today have not yet been found. I'll be meeting with a group of Nigerian human rights activists on this question in the coming weeks. But the idea of pastors being shot and killed, homes being burned, as I said, boarding schools being destroyed, and children being kidnapped, taken away from their families, people being these examples, maybe one knows in one country, but they're also in another. As a member of my faith, I was in an early hearing in my early stages of being a member of Congress. It was said that I couldn't be a member of the panel, couldn't be a member of the judiciary on a particular hearing because of my faith. So we know that none of our countries are perfect, but it is our duty to be vigilant, diligent, and to ensure that we are speaking and acting to protect those who engage in their innocent and sincere religious beliefs, who do not harm others, but simply are there to provide them with that religious comfort. I close by saying, as I recall, the Kosovo War, Albanian war, dealt with ethnic cleansing, and it happens all the time. So I think this hearing is extremely important. I thank chairpersons for having and holding this hearing, and I look forward to hearing the witnesses as well. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Jackson Lee. Just if I look a little distracted at times, there's a markup going on in the Foreign Affairs Committee on 58 recorded votes. 4 of them are mine, relevant to China. So when I look over to the side, please don't take that as lack of interest, because I'm absolutely interested in what all of you will be saying today. I would like to now introduce our first panelist, panel number 1, and that is Nadine Menza, who chairs the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Along with being a policy expert, noted speaker, a tremendous writer, very incisive writer with more than 2 decades of experience as an advocate for workers and families and champion for international religious freedom. She is also president of the Patriot Voices, where she shapes the organization's special emphasis on public policies that support working families. In addition, she has represented USCIRF in delegations to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, I should say, Bahrain, Indonesia, Iraq, Azerbaijan, Thailand, Taiwan, and Uzbekistan. So, Madam Chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Co-Chair Smith and Co-Chair McGovern, and also other members of this commission. Thank you for including the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom at this hearing today. As we gather here, as you know, people around the world continue to be systematically and violently targeted for their faith, or for their choice to hold no faith at all, by both governments and non-state actors. Governments impose laws that discriminate against religious communities and restrict their right to express their faith and to worship how they see fit, imposing steep penalties, imprisonment, and even death for blasphemy, apostasy, for failing to officially register their faith group, for worshiping in an unauthorized space, or just for their existence or identification as a religious community. Non-state groups and individuals often use these laws to justify violent attacks against religious minorities, worshipers, and houses of worship. In USCIRF's most recent annual report covering 2020, we have recommended that the Department of State designate 14 countries of particular concern, or a CPC, 10 of those which have already been designated. Those are Burma, China, Eritrea, Iran, Nigeria, North Korea, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. The other 4 countries yet to be designated as a CPC are India, Russia, Syria, and Vietnam. We also recommended the State Department maintain on their special watch list 2 countries, Cuba and Nicaragua, but to add 10 more to that list, including Afghanistan, Algeria, Azerbaijan, Egypt, Indonesia, Iraq, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Turkey, and Uzbekistan. In addition, we determined that 3 countries have made sufficient progress that no longer meet those lists, which are Bahrain, Central African Republic, and Sudan. In addition to these country conditions, we have identified several key themes, which you've already heard from from the co-chairs today. The first is governments responded to the COVID-19 pandemic with sweeping restrictions. Some, of course, were justified, but some have disproportionately targeted religious minorities, increasing discrimination, restrictions, and blaming religious groups for the spread of this virus. Jewish communities were especially targeted in this manner, as the spread of the pandemic sparked a new surge in anti-Semitism already on the rise. The destruction of houses of worship continue to be a key trend in dozens of countries around the world, targeting these symbols of religious identity that are supposed to be places of refuge. Across the globe, 84 countries maintain blasphemy laws, many of which are enforced by the state and carry severe penalties. In several instances, political unrest prompted the emergence of the religious freedom violations, such as Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and Yemen. We find also Yazidis, Christians, and others displaced from genocide 7 years ago in Iraq and Syria are still unable to return because of threats from Iranian-aligned militias, Turkey, and then, of course, the reemergence of ISIS cells. As you heard from Co-Chair Smith, religious freedom conditions in China and the extension of its influence beyond its borders represents the most troubling development for us in 2020. In addition to the genocide of the Uyghurs, and coordinated campaign to synthesize Islam, Tibetan Buddhism, and Christianity, the government exercised its broad economic and geopolitical influence to pressure countries to accept its demands without concern for human rights. USER felt this over the last year ourselves when the government of China sanctioned 3 of our own commissioners. The Biden administration, we are pleased, has signaled its commitment to champion human rights, including religious freedom, and centering the safety and dignity of religious communities as foreign policy priorities. President Biden signed a presidential determination in April that revised and reallocated the countries and regions from which the United States would accept refugees in the current year. And he signed a subsequent presidential determination in May that raised the refugee ceiling from 15,000 to 62,500 for the remainder of the fiscal year. We urge the administration to prioritize those refugees who are most vulnerable, including those who are survivors of the most egregious forms of religious persecution. The Biden administration is also conducting an interagency review to determine whether atrocities committed against the Rohingya by the Burmese military amount to genocide. We recommend that they definitively and publicly conclude these atrocities, both committed and ongoing, constitute genocide and act accordingly. We're also pleased to have just received confirmation that the administration plans to implement President Trump's executive order advancing international religious freedom, integrates this issue into U.S. diplomacy and development efforts. As you know, religious freedom conditions overall continue to deteriorate around the world, and there are always ways we can do better. So in addition to the recommendations I've already mentioned, I will highlight other opportunities for Congress and the administration to further advance religious freedom. There's pending legislation in Congress that contains several of USER's policy recommendations that could create a strong response to severe religious freedom violations, including the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the Ukraine Religious Freedom Support Act, and the Vietnam Human Rights Act. We urge you to look closely at these and other relevant legislation. USERF urges the Biden administration to continue to lead the multilateral initiatives that have been set up, including the International Religious Freedom Ministerial, and also the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance. Officially launched in February of 2020, this network of 32 like-minded countries is committed to opposing religious persecution and advancing freedom of religion or belief for all. As the Biden administration reviews its Syria policy, USERF urges them to take actions to support the autonomous administration of North and East Syria so it can continue as a refuge for religious minorities. We recommend giving them political recognition as a legitimate local government, lifting sanctions from the area they govern, and including them in all discussions for a political solution. Lastly, the Biden administration should move promptly to nominate and appoint well-qualified individuals to key religious freedom vacancies, particularly the ambassador at large and USERF commissioners. Thank you, Co-Chair Smith and McGovern, and all the members of the Commission for continuing to show Congress and the administration that human rights and international religious freedom in particular are longstanding bipartisan priorities that we can all work on together regardless of other political differences. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Chairwoman Menza, thank you so much for your leadership and your very eloquent statement. There's so much to cover, and you did cover so very much. So,
and I missed out so much, but thank you.
Appreciate it. And as one who reads the report that you put out, it is so illuminating. You know, Frank Wolf was brilliant in not just establishing under IRFA in 1998 the office at the State Department, but also the commission. which then acts as, just another very powerful voice, and you're leading so well. So thank you so very much for that. I have a lot of questions, but I'll keep them narrow it. You mentioned China, obviously. Many of us, I have a vote coming up in about 15 minutes on an amendment that I offered in Foreign Affairs, and it's a recorded vote. So if I look away to say aye, it's for that. It's to move the Genocide Olympics to a different city or country. It's still, if the political will exists, it's there. We could do that. They only won 44-40. Kazakhstan was the competitor for the Olympics. And to think that we would provide such a benefit, we mean in the whole international community, to Xi Jinping while he's simultaneously eviscerating religious belief everywhere, especially the Muslims, the Christians as well, but it is an actual genocide, as you know so well, is unconscionable. So maybe you might want to just speak a little bit further on the genocide. Secondly, you mentioned the Vietnam Human Rights Act. I am the author of that. It has passed the House on 4 other occasions. It's pending right now. It is totally bipartisan. We passed it in the House, and it gets a hold over on the Senate side and never sees the light of day. I know that Jake Sullivan, our National Security Advisor, met with the Deputy Prime Minister on July 1st. We're told that religious freedom was not brought up. Maybe you want to speak to that if you know about that. But it seems to me that, when Vietnam is going backwards everywhere, what they're doing against the journalists, the people that they're online, the human rights advocates of every kind, but what they're doing to the Montagnard, the Hmong, and other Christians is just appalling, as well as the Buddhists with their fake Buddhist threats that they set up. So I just wondered, if you did give a plug for the bill, and I'm very grateful for that. But my hope is that we can get that bill across the finish line. Friends don't let friends commit human rights abuses. Vietnam likes to say out of their embassy here, it's a country, not a war. Stop relitigating the war. Who's doing that? We're saying that human rights is what a country, first and foremost, is empowered and it really has a more responsibility to do. So if you could speak to that as well. And finally, within our hemisphere, what countries do you think are most disconcerting to us when it comes to religious freedom?
Okay. Well, thanks so much for those wonderful questions. I hope I remember them all. First of all, starting with China, we have, we have spoken out frequently about our concerns about the Beijing hosting the 2022 Winter Olympic Games, and we believe in no way, shape, or form should the Olympics be held there. The U.S. community can easily, as you said, there was a close runner-up. We could easily change the location to another country, and we should. And we also, if that isn't done, then U.S. officials should not be attending these games. So, we feel that this genocide is should be in the front and center of any interaction with China. It's been disappointing for me personally to find out that the Xinjiang Act that I mentioned earlier, is opposed, for instance, by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. That we should all come together, and regardless of business, human rights, especially genocide, has got to be something that the one time the world could all come together and say no, is when something is so clearly a genocide as it is in China. So, we've continued to speak strong about China, and the Vietnam situation reminds me of China a few years back, where private meetings, people would talk, tough about China, but you knew that once they were in those meetings about economic issues, China, human rights were not at the table, and so we see that with India too, where we don't believe they're at the table. We hope they will be. There are these instances where these egregious violations, these CPC countries. So we're not talking about, offending Christians. We're talking about Christians, Muslims, and others. Real serious, egregious, ongoing, systematic violations of religious freedom that really need to be front and center when the U.S. government is sitting with all of these countries. And so I appreciate your leadership and your willingness to mention them. I think the other one you mentioned, I should have written them all down, was in our own hemisphere. I know that we've spoken out on both Nigeria and Cuba. We know the Catholic communities especially have been targeted, I believe, in both communities, countries, and the U.S. government has got to show leadership and when they're in any sort of relationship. And I know obviously Cuba's a little different because we don't have a diplomatic relations right now, I believe, on the ground there, but it is to raise these with these countries.
Thank you. Chairman McGovern?
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. You mentioned that USERF determined that Bahrain had made sufficient progress to warrant being removed from the special watch list. Can you tell us on what basis you made that judgment? Because the situation for the Shia doesn't seem like it's changed very much.
So we certainly are concerned about the situation with Shias. We continue to dialogue. We've already had a call with Bahrain this year. We will continue to write about it. We do know they have some human rights concerns. So really the question is, does it meet the threshold of meeting two of the egregious, systematic and ongoing violations of religious freedom? We know that people of all faiths practice their faith there. I attended a Hindu temple that was 100 years old. I interacted with many Christians who had no interruption with the practice of their faith. Certainly the relationship with the Shia community is very complicated, and we're still concerned about it as well. But we think it's important for the integrity of the system that we hold these guidelines, and that if a country doesn't meet them, that they're not listed. So this is why the countries that do meet them there's more targeting on those particular countries.
So in evaluating the state of religious freedom in a country, does USERF consider the state of related rights like freedom of association and expression, and like how do those rights figure in?
Yeah, if they fit into the religious, if they're violating them in a religious freedom context, absolutely. But if it's a situation where it's artists that are expressing themselves and they're being challenged, and if there's no religious component, we probably don't speak into that, because we know there are others that are better suited to speak into those particular. We really try to stay within our mandate. And of course, personally, as commissioners, often a lot of us are speaking into things a little out of that mandate, but USERF as a whole tries to stay within that mandate.
So in 2018, USERF published an excellent report on the intersection of freedom of religion and women's rights. Has there been any follow-up on that?
We have been talking about that pretty heavily. I personally was able, as I think I spoke with you earlier about, to visit Northeast Syria and see how they were able to, build a government where, the equality of gender, ethnicity, and religion all at the same time, how all three of those were important, that everyone be treated equally, and how they embedded that to make sure that they had leaders that were all ethnically, religiously, and had different genders. So what you saw is I think that gender equality went faster and religious freedom moved faster because they were united. So we have been talking internally about how better to move forward and do some more investigating and looking at other parts of the world where we're seeing different rights progressing, because I do believe there is that, when you see that integration, it is a powerful thing.
And just, and USERF has looked at the impact of financial regulations on freedom of religion. Are there any plans to look at the impact of anti-terrorism legislation?
We have spoken into that, usually when it's being used against communities to violate their rights. But we haven't recently been talking about any new projects, and we certainly would welcome any recommendations you would have.
Yeah, maybe we could follow up with you on that, because I think that may be an important thing to look into. And let me just finally thank you for the work that you and your team do at USERF. We very much appreciate it, and again, I appreciate you being here today.
Well, thank you, and I just want to say to both you and Chairman Smith and all of the members of the commission, I'm moved that you choose to spend your time on these issues. I know you don't necessarily get a lot of it's not a voting right for your constituents usually. So I know that you're doing it. It's the right thing to do. And that means a whole lot to us at USERF. So we have a huge amount of respect, me personally, as well as others at the commission, for what you do.
We feel equally positive about the work that you do. So I will yield back. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Mr. Bilirakis? Ms. Jackson-Lee?
And transfer it to corporations. Again, that's a.
Thank you very much. Let me thank you very much to the witness, Ms. Mienza, for your leadership on the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Let me just ask a question. In your worldly experience, has religious freedom gotten worse? We're in 2021, and we've been at this for a pretty long time. We've, even in this Congress, have legislated, and we have spoken, even though Secretary Clinton, then First Lady Clinton, said women's rights are human rights. we've all utilized that to say religious rights are human rights, civil liberties, civil rights are human rights. So has it gotten worse? And how so?
Yes, unfortunately, it has gotten worse. And what we're seeing is, I think, a threat of nationalism too that you're seeing in different parts of the world, whether it be in Burma or in India, where people and I think social media has frankly given people the tools to make to move this quicker, where there's this I want to say ethnic or religious nationalism, because I think there's a civic nationalism which is a healthy thing, right? You're proud of your country. So we're not talking about that, but that sense that the other is a dangerous thing, and that we have to keep the others from having a voice or having rights. And so I think we're seeing some of that is certainly spread in areas and where they're turning on the religious minorities and considering taking away their voices and seeing violence. And so there's some different things like that we've seen that several years ago weren't quite as prevalent.
You know, I've been reading about, certainly not to my joy, about Nazism and the rise of Nazism in Germany, and it's been characterized as a purity of race, but obviously there was an element of religious practice and faith in that as well. Most people don't associate that horrors with also the extinction and elimination of people who had a different faith from Germany. So we know that religious freedom can go to the worst levels, and it can wind up in a massive loss of life. Would you comment on such incidences that you're aware of? And let me just follow up with a second question as it relates to technology. We realize that China has exported surveillance technology to countries such as Belarus, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. Is there reasonable indication that these technologies will be used by these countries in a similar fashion as currently leveraged by China to monitor religious minorities and other groups of people, including political dissidents? So if you could comment
Sure.
on that, religious freedom can result in massive loss of life, massacres, and then this whole idea of technology to be utilized against religious minorities or religious groups.
Sure. Well, first of all, on your first point, we've seen in Burma, for instance, Asrin Weerathru, a Buddhist.
Can you check?
A Buddhist.
I may be off.
Am I? Hold on. Sorry, I just lost my screen. Is my?
Looks like I'm off. Wait, why wouldn't this thing be over here?
Okay. I'm sorry. Can you hear me okay? We're seeing this Buddhist monk in Burma who, Can
you hear me?
I can. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to try again. Is that good?
It's perfect for me. I can hear you.
Great. Then I'll keep going.
I can hear you too, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps it's on her end. So we have seen in Burma, for instance, how this Buddhist monk said that the Buddhists were going to just be I think he said something like a mark on the paper, they were just going to be a dot on a paper because of the growth of Muslims. And he actually called for people to commit atrocities against Muslims, and so he did this on Facebook. And we really understood that it seemed as at that point in time that the military was actually paying to do ads and to grow that on social media. So here you have a military that's using social media to spread out. So it is causing this mass violence that's being technology is being used to take these violent voices. So, we've seen that. We're seeing some of that in India as well, where government officials are indicating sayings about minorities that are causing some mass violence. And we're really afraid that it is going to grow to be a larger problem. And we are afraid of mass atrocities in some of these areas. I mean, I think we've seen with the coup, we're seeing some positive things about, as we've seen that some of these minority groups have now come out to apologize to the Rohingyas, for instance, for excluding them in the past, and seeing if there's a future for Burma that they need to include the Rohingyas. So there's some good stuff happening in Burma right now, even though this horrible coup happened. But the fact that mass atrocities are still possibility, and of course we're afraid of that in India as well, with this kind of language, and anytime there's this kind of nationalism and we're making the other dangerous, as I think the Holocaust Museum has spoken several times about this, and that's really the line where hate speech becomes dangerous, when the other person, that the other, quote unquote, becomes a dangerous force that you have to stop. And so, we're watching several places. In terms of technology, we did have a hearing about China and technology and the exportation of technology a few months ago, and we'd be glad to send around that fact sheet to all of you. We're very concerned about US technology in particular being used by China and these other countries to suppress their minorities. Of course, they say they're using them for other things. You understand, in Kazakhstan, you can get on a bus, and the bus will actually identify you by your face. You don't even have to put it. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And we know that some of this even identifies you by your bone structure, so they could tell if you're a Uyghur and things like that. These are really dangerous things for the U.S. to be helping with. The U.S. government should not be allowing U.S. companies to participate in this kind of technology and be able to make money off genocide.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jackson-Lee. And Chairwoman Menza, thank you so much. I have a lot more questions, but we'll send them to you if that's okay. Particularly on India, you touched on India a little bit, and Russia. And we've tried ever since CPC was lifted from Vietnam, which was a mistake because there were deliverables that the ambassador at large at that time thought were going to happen as part of a trade deal. None of it happened. Matter of fact, in many cases, it got worse. So it's time to reestablish CPC for Vietnam as well. So thank you that you have been outspoken. The commission has been speaks truth to power, including us, and I mean the State Department as well. Thank you for being that voice, because it's irreplaceable.
Thank you. We appreciate the partnership and the chance to work together.
Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it, Chairwoman. I'd like to now invite our second panel to provide their testimony, beginning first with Bob Fu, who is one of the leading voices in the world for persecuted faith communities in China. Bob spent time in a China gulag jail. He was born and raised there, of course, and was a student leader during the Tiananmen Square demonstrations for freedom and democracy back in 1989. He is the head of the president of China Aid, and many of us do count on him. I know Frank Wolf and I, when we were in Beijing protesting the 2008 Olympics, we were in regular contact with Bob Fu. We knew that the Chinese Communist Party was listening to every word, and I can give you a whole story about that, but we knew they were. But here's a man who's made a serious difference on behalf of all faiths, including and especially Christians. He is the winner of the 2020 Wilberforce Award from the Colson Center, and he's editor-in-chief of the Chinese Law and Religion Monitor. We'll then hear from Anthony Vance, who is the Director of Public Affairs for the Baha'i of the United States. Mr. Vance oversees the development of the office's program and strategic direction. He joined the office in 2010 after spending 4 years at the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel, representing it to the diplomatic community. A lawyer by training, he spent 21 years in the U.S. Agency for International Development in legal managerial positions in Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Botswana, and Egypt. He holds a BA in economics, MBA, and JD from Harvard University. We then hear from Amjad Khan, an adjunct professor of law at the UCL Law Center and partner with Brown, Neary, Smith, and Khan, where he practices commercial litigation. He served as judicial clerk for the Honorable Warren Ferguson, senior circuit judge for the U.S. Court of Appeals in the 9th District. Amjad's academic work focused on transnational legal issues, studies, comparative constitutional law, and national security. He is the National Director of Public Affairs for the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community USA. His Excellency, next witness, is Matthew Hassan Kukah, who is the Bishop of the Catholic Diocese of Sokoto, Nigeria. Bishop Kukah has participated in many Nigerian presidential initiatives, such as the Human Rights Violation Investigation Commission, Electoral Reform Committee, and National Political Reform Conference. He was the presidential facilitator who negotiated an end to the hostility between the Shell Petroleum Development Company and their Ogoni people. He also served on the committee set up by the Northern governors to examine the crisis of Boko Haram. He is chairman of the Interreligious Dialogue Committees for both the Bishops' Conference of Nigeria and West Africa, and a member of the Dicastery of Integral Human Development, Vatican City. We're very, very grateful to have him here joining us. We'll then hear from Dr. Elizabeth Hurd, a professor of political science and religious studies, who holds the Crown Chair in Middle East Studies at Northwestern University. Dr. Hurd has taught at Northwestern since 2002 and studies the impact of religion in U.S. foreign and immigration policy. She is the author of The Politics of Secularism in International Relations and Beyond Religious Freedom, The New Global Politics of Religion, both published by Princeton. She is co-editor of the Winifred Fowler Sullivan at Home and Abroad, The Politics of American Religion, and many, many other. She co-directs the Global Religion and Politics Research Group at Northwestern and co-curates the Teaching of Law and Religion Case Study Archive. We then hear from, we then need to hear from Dr. or Reverend, I should say, Susan Hayward, Associate Director for the Religious Literacy and Professions Initiative at Harvard University's Divinity School of Religion and Public Life. Yes. Smith votes aye. In this role, she works with leaders in secular defined fields and civic spaces to understand how religion impacts social, political, and economic life. Previously, Reverend Hayward spent 14 years with the U.S. Institute of Peace, Religion, and Inclusive Societies program, where she led the Institute's efforts to understand and engage religious factors and actors shaping conflict and peace worldwide. She helped implement projects in partnership with diverse religious communities in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Colombia, and Iraq. She serves as an advisor to the Transatlantic Policy Network for Religion and Diplomacy, the Taliban Center for Interreligious Understanding, and Churches for Middle East Peace. She studied Buddhism in Nepal and is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. And finally, we'll be hearing from Gulzira Ayalkan of the Kazakh Muslim minority from Xinjiang, who is originally from Xinjiang's Gulug County, coming from a family of cattle breeders. She moved to Kazakhstan with her family in 2014, where she and her husband would also do farm work and herding, and is now a legal Kazakhstan resident. Following a return to China in 2017, Gulzira was arrested and spent over a year in various concentration camps and was forced to labor in a factory. Following media exposure of her case, she quickly she was interrogated and she was allowed to join her family. I would just want to point out for the record before we go to the Reverend Bob Fu, about 10 minutes ago we had a vote in the Foreign Affairs Committee on an amendment that I had offered to the Eagle Act on creating a strategy to move the Genocide Olympics to a different city and a different country to make the attempt. I'm sorry to report that it failed 21 to 26 in a recorded vote, and that's the votes we're doing right now as we meet in this hearing. So that's bad news. I'm going to try to get it made in order for the floor vote, but it did lose in committee. I'd like to now yield to Bob Fu.
The Honorable Co-Chairman Congressman Chris Smith and Congressman Jim McGovern, members of the Lantos Commission, my fellow distinguished witnesses, panelists. First, I'd like to ask both co-chair to allow my full written testimony as part of the congressional permanent record.
Without objection, your full statement, as well as all of our witnesses, will be made to the part of the record, as well as any other materials you think are relevant.
Thank you. Friends, today, as the world witnessed the worst religious persecution and rule of law seen in China since Mao's Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, the rule of law has replaced the rule of man has replaced the rule of law and rule by law. Under Chinese President Xi Jinping, even during the pandemic, each month in 2020, at the close of another decade, the Chinese Communist Party intensified its religious persecution. Implementing the banner of so-called Sinicization, the CCP launched a wide, comprehensive war against all perceived independent faiths. targeted groups, including Catholics, Protestant of both the independent and registered house churches and the government so-called patriotic movement religions, and of course including the Tibetan Buddhist, the Falun Gong practitioners, the Muslims of Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, as well as Hui traditions and other emerging new sects. So in 2018, under the direction of Xi's so-called 5-year plan for the Sinicization of religion, designed to shape all religious faiths to become so-called compatible with the socialism and communism. In the persecution against the Christian communities, for example, the CCP intends not only to put Christianity or Christian faith under its full control of its evil government, but also with the intention even to wipe out those the genuine faiths and the followers of Christian faith. As official, even the government-sanctioned churches, as I just mentioned, their crosses, thousands of crosses were being demolished, being burnt, being destroyed, and also many of the churches, if they are allowed to exist, they are forced to sing the Communist Party revolutionary songs during the Sunday worship, to fly and wave the Communist Party flags on the pulpit, and to listen to the secondary sermons censored by the party leaders. So as of today, the CCP completely outlawed any non-government churches called house churches. And this include, of course, other religious faiths too, in the Muslim mosques and Buddhist temples. Those clergymen, those members were also forced to sinicize the religion by placing Chairman Xi Jinping's portrait, replacing their religious symbols like crosses and others. So in 2020 alone, China 8, according to our research, we find those the Communist Party authorities raided the Christian families' gatherings, even in their own homes during the pandemic. Family members were being taken out and detained for their worship. Forced to sign a Communist Party paper to renounce their faith. This has not happened since the Cultural Revolution. And the children who used to have their homeschool choice in their home were all forbidden and forced to move to the government communist-run propaganda schools. So the CCP basically attempted to wipe out all these independent faiths and forcing believers who are holding the professions such as a teacher, as a doctor, as a nurse, they are all forbidden to believe their faith or practice their faith. Authorities requires the schools and parents to basically totally give up their faith. So officials also remove all the access to their secret literatures like the Bibles from any platforms, bookstores and online like platforms in the e-commerce. So we have seen this deteriorating situation reflected in a number of cases. We have seen the increase of the arrest, arbitrary detention of thousands. Of course, we already, both chairman and other members of this commission have mentioned the genocide in West China, in Xinjiang. Of course, the crackdown even in Hong Kong under the so-called national security law, churches, their banks were being frozen for simply being provided food and shelter for those peaceful protesters. So let me give you a few examples that I want your attention on this deteriorating situation of religious persecution and rule of law. We have seen, of course, Pastor John Hall, a Chinese American, who was arrested for building 16 schools for the Kachin minority in the China-Burma border. And he was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment in March 2018. And Pastor Wang Yi, the founder and civil rights lawyer, who met with President Bush in 2006, he received 9 years imprisonment on Christmas Day in 2019 after over 160 members of his church and deacons, of course, were arrested. And his wife, Jiang Rong, and their 13-year-old son were also arrested. And now their son turns to 15, is totally forbidden to have his private school education. And the police give him the right every day. He has to be on the police car to go to school and come back home. And his wife, Jiang Rong, suffered torture during her detention. And there's no lawyer access for him. And of course, we have seen Gao Zhisheng, a civil rights, the religious freedom Christian lawyer who represents Falun Gong practitioners and Christians and many other faiths, after suffered 8 years of non-stop torture and enforced disappearance, only gave 3 years under house arrest after the American Bar Association published his book. And then 4 years ago, August 23rd, 2017, he was disappeared again. And 4 years already, there's no word from him, dead or alive. And his wife and 2 children, we rescued them into the US. For 12 years, there's no communication. So that is the so-called rule of law. I have seen today, actually, a gentleman who is sitting next to me, Mr. Li Chuanliang. He served in 2 cities as deputy mayors in China until 2014, and he resigned because he's just had enough of the Communist Party's propaganda. So he left China. But because in December 2019, just on the eve of the pandemic, he already heard through his internal sources that this is a pandemic, this is COVID-19, this is transmitted from human to human, just because he told his former comrades, who was a mayor at the time, a party secretary in another city. So that party secretary just started mobilizing, before the Xi Jinping ordered, of course, the start of the COVID-19, because that mayor acted too early, and so that mayor was arrested, and because Mr. Li Chuanliang advocated for him in the United States of America. Now his wife, not his wife, his pregnant daughter, and his son-in-law, his brother, his sister had been all arrested. And his daughter, after 4.5 months in prison, they finally released her, and even basically forced her to sign a form, said, we didn't know you were pregnant. And she gave birth to a baby recently, and now she's still on trial. They want to bring her back to prison with that, even with a small baby just being birthed. And Mayor Li Chuanliang himself is now put on the Interpol list And the Chinese Communist Party security communicated through his family, said, if you shut up in the United States, don't talk about the COVID-19, the truth about the cover-up, and return to China, surrender, we will release your family members. And friends, I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I just give you some examples. So in conclusion, some of the recommendations to really end this the genocide regime, I think we need to take concrete actions. I think I totally agree with the co-chair Congressman Smith to boycott this Olympics, because a country that is committing genocide, a crime against humanity, is automatically disqualified to host Olympics, who promote equality and freedom. And I also urge Congress to quickly pass this Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in order to confront this vast labor system put out in place by the CCP. In addition to that, I think we all really need to urge the administration, President Biden, his senior leaders, Secretary Blinken, to meet with these victims, the survivors of the concentration camp. We just rescued, Mr. Guzero is one of them who testified. Meet them in the White House, in the State Department, to show to the Communist Party leaders, Xi Jinping, we do care, and to also to show those victims that we care about them and their family members. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Reverend Fu. I noticed that Andy Harris, Dr. Andy Harris, member of Congress and a leader on human rights from Maryland, has joined us. Dr. Harris, did you want, I know you're in a markup with appropriations, just we're in a markup as well in foreign affairs. Would you like to make any comments?
No, just thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding the hearing. Obviously, a very timely topic with what's going on, especially with regards to China. And again, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. I'd like to now yield, if I could, to Anthony Vance and to provide his testimony. And thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank you and the entire commission for providing the opportunity to testify today. Although as the director of the U.S. Baha'i Office of Public Affairs, I'm most familiar with the situation of the Baha'is in Iran. At the same time today, I'm going to talk not only about the Baha'is, but a little later about other religious minorities in Iran and what's happening to them. At the outset, though, I think it's helpful to understand that the Baha'i faith is an independent world religion that began in the middle of the 19th century, which today has over 5 million followers in over 200 countries and territories, representing virtually every racial, ethnic, and national group on the planet. Now, after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, Baha'is became the target of severe and systematic state-sponsored persecution, and it became official government policy to oppress Baha'is. In the years following the revolution, over 250 Baha'is were killed, the majority by execution. Thousands of Baha'is were imprisoned, many of them tortured. Baha'i holy places were destroyed, and Baha'i cemeteries have repeatedly been attacked and desecrated. The government also made and continues to make concerted efforts to impoverish the Baha'i community. After the revolution, Baha'is were dismissed from government jobs and denied pensions. And to this day, private employers are pressured not to hire Baha'is. Baha'is still suffer frequent raids on their homes and businesses, including the closure of small shops. They're barred from 24 occupations, and their property is routinely seized without compensation. In fact, in the second half of 2020, two provincial appellate courts confirmed the seizure of some 50 Baha'i homes, including adjacent farmlands in the village of Ivel in Mazandaran province. The courts confirmed the lower court finding that, quote, the perverse sect of Baha'ism is confirmed as heretical and unclean, and there is no legitimacy in their ownership, end quote. These appellate court decisions, if used as precedent across Iran, would have a devastating impact on the already struggling Baha'i community. Baha'is were also dismissed from university positions after the revolution, and Baha'i students have been excluded from the nation's universities since then. Arbitrary arrests and imprisonments remain commonplace, with over 24 Baha'is in prison and with typically 3 times that number out of prison awaiting trial, sentencing, or appellate processes. Of particular concern at this time has been a surge in anti-Baha'i hate propaganda in state-sponsored media outlets, including online sites as well as television and radio. For historical perspective, in 2014, approximately 401 anti-Baha'i written news pieces or broadcasts were appearing every month. During the first 4 months of 2021, the average was 1,034 per month, more than double the 2014 level, and an increase of 44% over the monthly average in calendar year 2020. We believe that this increase is significant enough to warrant concern that the Iranian government is preparing its population to either support or acquiesce to a planned increase in persecution of the Baha'i community. The slander in this hate propaganda is designed to provoke the most visceral negative responses to an Iranian audience by describing Baha'is as spies of Israel and Western powers, and Baha'i meetings as secret orgies. The Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, has issued and repeatedly reissued a religious decree prohibiting Iranian Muslims from associating with members of the, quote, deviant sect, unquote, a well-known reference to Baha'is. The clerical establishment has long promoted the view that Baha'is are ritually unclean and that the blood of Baha'is is mubah, meaning that it can be spilled with impunity. History, of course, tells us that increased hate propaganda often precedes increased persecution. We hope that this is not the case here, but feel it is important to alert this commission and the international community to the possibility. Now, unlike the Baha'i faith, Christianity, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism are recognized as official religions under the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Their adherents are reserved a total of 5 seats in Iran's 290-member parliament. Nevertheless, they face serious restrictions on their religious activities. Muslim religious groups not conforming to Shia Islam, such as Sunni Muslims, or to the regime's version of Shia Islam, such as the Gonabadi Sufis, face varying degrees of persecution. For instance, the International Organization for the Preservation of Human Rights has reported that there are currently 8 Gonabadi Sufis in prison for their faith, and another 34 in internal exile in remote locations in Iran, and that after the death of their leader, Dr. Nur Ali Tabandeh, who, while under house arrest in December of 2019, the government has seized assets of the Sufi order and installed its own candidate as their new leader. Article 18, the well-known human rights NGO, which focuses on the persecution of Christian converts in Iran, reports that there are currently at least 23 Christians in prison for their faith, and at least another 53 who are not in prison, but awaiting trial, sentencing, or the completion of appellate processes. As with Baha'is, these individuals are commonly charged with endangering national security and making propaganda against the regime. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity to make this testimony.
Mr. Vance, thank you so very much for your testimony and leadership. You know, one of my proud moments in the early 1980s as a member of Congress was to stand with Ronald Reagan when he spoke out in defense of the Baha'i in Iran. And you have yourself carried this cause forward and pressed so hard. So thank you for your testimony. It does help all of us to do a better job in combating the discrimination against the Baha'i. So
thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to now invite Amjad Khan for his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I wanted to thank both the co-chairs of the Tom Lantos Commission and all the members of the commission. It's really an honor and privilege to be back. I've had several occasions to testify before this body, and I applaud all of the great work that the commission is doing. This afternoon, I have a lengthier written statement, which is now a part of the record, but I'll be highlighting some aspects of persecution affecting the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. As I mentioned, I've testified about the persecution of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the past. They're among the most persecuted Muslim communities in the world. The U.S. State Department, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, both in their 2020 reports it's replete with references to the persecution of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community at the hands of religious extremists and state and quasi-state institutions in many countries in the world, including Pakistan, Algeria, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Libya, and Syria. But today, I focus on Pakistan. And with respect to Pakistan, in prior testimony over the years, I've outlined important historical and legal markers that inform why Ahmadi Muslims are the subject of abuse by state institutions and groups that the government of Pakistan is unwilling or incapable of controlling. I've discussed how Pakistan's constitution strips the ability of Ahmadi Muslims by constitutional amendment, the Second Amendment to its constitution, to self-identify and profess to be Muslims. A remarkable situation, the only Muslim state in the entire world that defines who is or is not a Muslim and excludes an entire community from self-identifying. And how Pakistan's criminal and anti-blasphemy provisions include anti-Ahmadi laws that criminalize the very existence of Ahmadis for being perceived as, quote, posing as Muslims. For over 40 years since the passage of that constitutional amendment, Ahmadi Muslims have been murdered in large numbers, over 350, and many hundreds more have been prosecuted and imprisoned. Now, the Ahmadiyya Muslim community has, some estimates are over 1 million in Pakistan. There's many Ahmadis who have fled Pakistan owing to this incredible situation. Ahmadi Muslims profess to be Muslims, but essentially their belief is irrelevant under the law for the reasons that I've stated. And the blasphemy provisions and the anti-Ahmadi provisions punish activities, basic activities, like for an Ahmadi to say an Islamic greeting, to call their mosque a mosque. These are arrestable offenses, and they can be charged and imprisoned, and in fact, in many cases, they are. I wish to highlight some recent data and some recent trends that this commission should note, because, of course, this issue is well documented, but this information I hope this commission will find useful. As I mentioned about the violence against the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, it is definitely on the uptick. In fact, in the past decade alone, over 80 Ahmadi Muslims have been murdered. This was after the Taliban massacred 86 Ahmadi Muslims in 2010. On average, an Ahmadi Muslim is killed every 6 weeks over the past decade in Pakistan. And just in the past 12 months, 6 Ahmadi Muslims were murdered in cold blood, including one Ahmadi who was shot in open court while he was awaiting his day in court. Since 1974, as I mentioned, in contravention of their own beliefs, every single Ahmadi Muslim man, woman, and child in Pakistan is declared to be non-Muslim by constitutional amendment. And now the state has also criminalized private acts of worship by Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan. The mere thoughts, the apparent beliefs of Ahmadis are now being subject to criminal prosecution. Just in the past month, there were 2 new cases about that, which we've never seen before. Since 1985, millions of Ahmadi Muslims cannot, by operation of law, fully and freely vote in national and provincial elections. This is an amazing situation. The only community that's excluded from the joint electorate. The only way for an Ahmadi Muslim to vote is to declare themselves to be non-Muslim, to declare the founder of the community to be an imposter, and add their names to a supplemental list. Of course, no Ahmadi Muslim in good conscience would ever vote under these legally and morally reprehensible restrictions. And there's been 4,500 cases nearly registered against Ahmadi Muslims under Pakistan's anti-blasphemy laws. 40% of all arrests. We know those laws suffocate the rights of so many, including Christians and Hindus. In 2021 alone, just in these 6 months, 19 new cases against Ahmadi Muslims have been registered, including to the top senior leaders of the community. Again, these are new trends. To date, Ahmadi authorities have Pakistani authorities have demolished Ahmadi mosques, set on fire or forcibly occupied or sealed over 175 of them. They've denied the cemetery burial of at least 75 Ahmadi Muslims, exhumed after burial the bodies of at least 39 Ahmadi Muslims. Just this year, in 6 months, 8 Ahmadi Muslim mosques have been destroyed by the police, officially, by local police authorities at the behest of anti-Ahmadi extremists. And I note a few trends about this. The police at the provincial and local levels, they fail to provide any adequate protection, in many cases complicit in the persecution, torture, and ultimate murder. These are filmed now on social media. It's brazen. Ahmadi Muslim professionals, including physicians, many lawyers I know, teachers, lawyers, by the way, that I've worked with, that I've advocated with, have been killed because of their defense of Ahmadi Muslims. The perpetrators of attacks on Ahmadis are rarely arrested or charged. Frivolous cases continue to mount. And in a recent disturbing opinion, the Lahore High Court even permitted prosecutions of private apparent beliefs, meaning this has widened the door for Pakistan to criminalize the private thoughts of Ahmadi Muslims. And the final area that I wish to highlight for this body, which is incredibly disturbing, is the use of state-sponsored cyber laws to target Ahmadi digital content and individuals by the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority. Through this period, vigilante violence is on the rise, and it's particularly true with respect to the weaponization of cyber laws. And I wish to point out here, this is very important for the Commission to note, that anti-Ahmadi clerics with close ties to influential Pakistani officials are working in tandem with the Federal Investigation Agency, the FIA, the cyber agency tasked with enforcing Pakistan cyber laws, to target Ahmadi officials by embroiling them in a web of frivolous cases. And there's a legal change. In November of last year, the Pakistan government, they enacted a new regulation which would amend PICA, the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, to broaden Pakistan's governmental authority to initiate new legal actions against website operators outside of Pakistan, not just inside. And there's one particular legal provision, as a lawyer and a law professor who studied this for 2 decades, I have not seen a more staggering or sweeping extraterritorial reach, which is Section 37 of PICA, gives the PTA unbridled powers to block and remove content, to order Facebook, Google, Twitter, YouTube, to remove information it considers necessary in the interest of the glory of Islam or the integrity, security, or defense of Pakistan, public order, decency, or morality. And disturbingly, and this is the key provision, the new cyber law applies to, quote, any act committed outside of Pakistan by any person if that act constitutes an offense and affects the person, property, or IT located in Pakistan. And this has hit close to home, Chairman Smith and Chairman McGovern. On December 24th, the day before Christmas, the PTA sent a legal notice to 2 U.S. citizens, including myself, threatening us for criminal prosecution for blasphemy because our U.S. Ahmadi Muslim community website is posing to be a Muslim website. And they gave us 24 hours to comply. They threatened 500 million rupee fine, 3.1 million US dollars, and this is key, prosecution under the criminal blasphemy laws of US citizens. And this, of course, has prompted us to seek legal counsel, and indeed we have legal counsel to defend against this incredibly brazen act. The unprecedented official government action came as PTA is issuing takedown notices to Google and Wikipedia to remove Ahmadi content. This is now, the PTA has banned over 20 websites of the Ahmadi community outside of Pakistan, including the UK, Canada, and Australia, and their citizens over there. And they've also ordered the removal of all Ahmadi digital content, and Ahmadis can't come out publicly without fear. So privately, we can't even consume our own digital content to even read the Quran online, forcing the tech companies to remove our content. So I would just say here at the end, there are a number of recommendations that I've given in the written testimony. I just want to summarize the first three. With respect to the voting issue, which is front and center for the community, we ask that the commission look into urging the Pakistani government to repeal Chief Executive Order number 15 to permit Ahmadi Muslims to vote alongside all other citizens of Pakistan and become a part of the joint electorate without any religious test. Of course, to stop the extraterritorial prosecution of foreign citizens, of U.S. citizens, for alleged cyber and blasphemy crimes, and to cease and desist from directing technology companies to remove or alter Ahmadi Muslim content. I look forward to your questions, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Khan, and thank you for informing us how that long reach, particularly on the internet, has reached you personally and others. And we will have some questions, all of us, I think, for you later on, but thank you so very, very much. I'd like to now invite Bishop Kukah from Nigeria and ask him to give his testimony to our commission.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Smith, and thank you for your co-chair too for this very kind invitation. I know I was in your office some 4 or 5 years ago in the company of Aid to the Church in Need, and I think you've actually made my job very easy because your presentation and your reference to Nigeria was most eloquent, and I really want to thank you for paying attention to our situation. I think that a lot of things have come to a head in the last 10 or more years with Boko Haram and so on, but I think it's important to note, that this has been a slow burning candle. It only just escalated, but since independence, the whole question of religious freedom for minorities in northern Nigeria has been an issue of very serious concern, in part because of the nature of the history of the country itself, and the fact that the British conquered the Sokoto Caliphate. And then as now, the feeling among the predominant segment of the Muslim population has been the need to insert or assert the supremacy of Islamic law. And for many cases, even in the course of our constitutional debate, the belief that what the Holy Quran dictates is superior to the provisions of the Nigerian constitution. And that also has, the larger effect of that on Christians has been the fact that up till now, the issues of access to places of worship, the fact that, Muslim militants have absolutely no qualms about the destruction of Christian churches at the slightest provocation, even when a lot of the issues have absolutely no direct bearing with the situations in Nigeria. The killing of Osama bin Laden, for example, a significant part of the Muslim extremists reacted to that by venting out their anger on the destruction of churches and so on. So we've lived through with this, but I think that events in the Northeast with the coming of Boko Haram simply has raised the stake. A lot of the information is pretty well known, and I don't think that it needs repeating. You've made the point in your own reference to Nigeria, namely the consistent and the persistent destruction of church properties. And as you know, from the beginning of time, so to say, from the emergence of the modern state across the world, the Catholic Church has been at the forefront of the provision of social services, education, health services, and so on. So indeed, unlike many other institutions, we are at the lowest level of society. So we feel the pulse of our people. A significant percentage of senior Muslims in Nigeria and non-Christians and non-Catholics are beneficiaries of Catholic education. So this assault and attack on our physical infrastructure has come to us with a lot of shock. But it's been also, like you said very clearly, we have to place this in the context of the emergence and the global ambitions of Salafist Islam, and more or less what that has brought to us. In the last 10 or so years, we've witnessed things that we never dreamt about before. That is the mindless targeting and slaughtering and kidnapping of church personnel in 2018, for example. And this is not the first time. Two of our priests and 17 of their parishioners were slaughtered during morning mass. And in a lot of the killings, there's actually no relationship between the atrocities themselves and the activities of ordinary people. Before now, one or two or three of our priests had been killed in a moment of crisis. Last year, the bandits invaded our seminary and kidnapped 4 of our seminarians. I'm sure the killing of Michael, the seminarian from my diocese in Sokoto, gained quite a lot of global attention. But what was also very significant for us as Christians is that one day a policeman drove into the seminary and they came with a few people they had in their vehicle to report that they had actually captured the people who killed Michael. And what was very significant for us was that Michael was supposed to have been killed on grounds that he was just an 18-year-old kid. But the Muslim, his kidnapper, said, look, we were shocked that this young man was standing before us and calling on us to repent, despite knowing that we were Muslims and despite seeing our guns and so on. So I make this point just in passing to make the case that it's not as if Christians have been sitting back. Occasionally, many of our people have seen this as an opportunity to also bear witness. We've had a lot of other killings. As I said, there's probably no need for me to go into the details, but a lot of our young Christians who have been kidnapped, some of them have been forcefully asked to convert to Islam. Some have been turned into spies. Some have been turned into cooks. Some have been forcefully turned into sexual slaves. The story of Leah Sharibu suggests very clearly, that there is, in many instances, a correlation between the conditions in which people find themselves and the faith that they believe in. But very quickly, what has been the reaction of the church? And I speak here specifically on behalf of the Catholic Church. That we've always done what we have done best, namely to take very seriously Jesus's instruction that he has come that we may have life and have it to the full. And we continue to work relentlessly. We issue statements. We've called government's attention to the realities of the situation. We've also tried to reach out to let government understand our willingness and our commitment to work towards the greatness of our country. What is significant about the situation in Nigeria is that we are in a democracy, albeit a very weak, with all the weak structures, with all the inefficiency, with all the deficiencies. It's not as if we are struggling to overthrow a dictatorship, or that we have a situation in which some autocrat is in power and we need to get him out of the way so that we can establish a democracy. It is that these things are happening in a democracy. And I think what is also significant and worthy of note is that things have just unraveled, in the last 5 or 6 years since the coming to power of General Buhari. He didn't make Boko Haram happen, but the fact that today the Northwest and North Central and literally the length and breadth of Nigeria has now been invaded by bandits and headsmen and killers and all kinds of people who have come from God knows where. And the fact that the government just seems to be either helpless or almost uninterested in dealing decisively, with these people. This is what has added more confusion to the mix. And the contradiction here is that the president has blatantly pursued rather nepotistic, but also policies that show very clearly preferences for men and women of his faith. The entire security outfit now is in the hands of Muslims. The Chief Justice of Nigeria, who was a Christian, was replaced under very dubious circumstances. In the National Assembly, it was always the case that if you had a Christian as Senate President, you would have a Muslim as a Speaker, or whatever the case. But for the first time in the history of our country, literally every outlet is more or less been blocked because the Senate President is a Muslim, the Speaker of the House is a Muslim, the Deputy Speaker is a Muslim, the Majority Leader is a Muslim, and these are all fine gentlemen, but that's not the point. The point is that the level of anxiety among us as Christians and Muslims has exacerbated. And of course, the tragedy in all this is that it's not as if Muslims are having a better deal, because more Muslims have been killed as a result of the crisis that we're in, than Christians. But again, unfortunately, this is not the way we should be looking at this whole thing. And what the Bishops' Conference have also tried to push for is the need for us to focus on our common humanity. So by way of trying to end is to make the point that, first of all, our Justice and Peace Commissions and Caritas are doing fantastic work, in the areas of rehabilitation and helping our people to rebuild their lives. Some of the challenges are, of course, more that, they are beyond what we can deal with. But on a practical level, I think that the problems we have are existential problems. People are dying, and they are dying literally by the day. They are being killed, they are being slaughtered in their sleep. And the question as to how we will rebuild our country and how all this is going, what is going to happen? These are the challenges. And I give a very practical example here, and I don't know whether I should say it, but I think I should. The government of Hungary, for example, has intervened in a way, a manner that fits the kind of thing we're talking about. That is, beyond sanctions, we need concrete, actionable initiatives that change the lives of people. For example, in my diocese in Sokoto, which is made up of Sokoto, Kebbi, Zamfara, and Katsina, with help from the government of Hungary, we've been able to rebuild our schools. People's lives are changing. We're building a health facility in Sokoto, a diagnostic center, with the help from the Hungarian government. So I would like to appeal to the U.S. government to do two things. One, while talking to the federal government at a diplomatic level, it is important that government agencies like USAID and others begin a very concrete conversation with the various church organizations, so that we can get our children back to school. Because the only way we can fight Boko Haram is through education. Right now, we are dealing with the widows, we're dealing with orphans, we're dealing with children. In Nigeria alone, there are 15, 16 million young people who are on the streets. 80% or 90% of them are Muslim children. So it will not be possible for us to close this gap without, as if we go into the next phase with such a huge percentage of illiterate people, our problem can only get more complicated. So I really want to thank you for continuing with this engagement, but also just to conclude by saying the Nigerian situation is not a helpless situation, because a lot of the educated people in Nigeria are Christians. The fate of the Christian minorities in northern Nigeria, and of course, even Muslim minorities elsewhere, these are the issues. But I'd like to focus on the fact that we require practical, measurable forms of assistance that can help us to change the lives of our children, whether it is through scholarships or whether it is through the rebuilding of schools and so on and so forth. Something that the church has done and continues to do very well. Once again, I thank you very much for your very kind attention and privilege.
Bishop, thank you so very much for your testimony, for your advice to us. I would even call it admonishment, because we had missed, I think, many opportunities to make a difference on the ground, particularly when everything goes through the central government. It often, and I've been to Abuja many times. I've actually met with Archbishop Kegama in Jos and went to firebomb churches of his, where Boko Haram had done horrible things. And in a spirit of reconciliation and love, but also determination, they still wanted to work with the Muslim leadership in Jos. I met with the leaders there, and I was amazed how well they got along and how much they respected each other. And so both sides, Muslim and Christian, Catholic, despised what Boko Haram was doing. So thank you, as well as other radicalized elements in Nigeria. Thank you so much, and we'll come back to you in a few minutes with some questions. I'd like to now welcome Dr. Elizabeth Hurd, and ask her if she would provide her testimony to the commission.
Thank you, co-chairs McGovern and Smith, distinguished members of the Lantos Commission and staff members, and my distinguished fellow panelists. My name is Elizabeth Schachmanhart. I'm a professor of political science and religious studies at Northwestern University. I studied the politics of religious freedom, religion in U.S. foreign and immigration policy, and relations between the U.S. and the Middle East. My testimony today will be informed by 2.5 decades studying the intersections of religion, law, and politics. Religious freedom as a political ideal enjoys the support of many Americans and members of Congress. Yet today, I'm going to suggest the time has come to de-emphasize religion as a priority in American foreign policy. Elevating religion above all other factors risks doing damage to the cause of diversity and tolerance on the ground. My work suggests that the best way to support religious tolerance is to step back from religious freedom as a guiding principle in U.S. foreign policy in favor of justice, equality, and respect for diversity. To move away from a focus on religion does not mean ignoring or denigrating it. It is rather to respect the rich role and variety of religious traditions in social and political life. This respect requires that the government tread lightly. This is the American way. Imposing U.S. versions of religious freedom is not guaranteed to secure respect for religious diversity abroad. To the contrary, it may trample on it or even threaten it. I'll give 3 examples today of why this is the case, followed by 4 very brief policy recommendations. First, religious freedom is often mobilized in ways that deepen social divisions and increase the risk of conflict. Prioritizing religious freedom encourages people to base political claims on religious identities. This hardens lines of difference and makes societies more prone to conflict along those very religious lines. Elevating religion above other factors hardens divisions between communities by defining identities and interests in religious terms. This aggravates and exacerbates sectarian tensions by drawing a line under one's religious identity as a factor that trumps all others. Second, religious freedom privileges a right to believe at the expense of other ways of being religious. Practice-based, land-based, and other non-belief-based affinities are simply not protected. The result is less space for diversity. An example are the Quiche people of Guatemala. In 2010, 87 Maya communities represented by the Quiche People's Council, or KPC, unanimously rejected mining and hydroelectric projects proposed for Guatemala in the wake of NAFTA. Foreign commercial companies responded with offers to pay the KPC a higher percentage of profits, failing to understand that the reason these projects were rejected is not monetary, but rather is linked to the refusal to allow destruction of the earth for religious and cultural reasons. The KPC's refusal of these projects has led to discrimination and violence, including massive violations of their cultural heritage and land rights, facilitated by collusion among multinational mining corporations, the police, and the Guatemalan state. And yet, in 2012, our own U.S. State Department reported, quote, no reports of abuses of religious freedom in Guatemala. Quiche attachment to the land does not qualify them for religious freedom protection. Their claims are simply ignored because they are perceived as having no religion. Violations of their religious and cultural heritage are literally invisible because religious freedom privileges a right to belief. Third, to define religious freedom requires defining religion, and as we all know, that is just not the job of the government. Defining religion is no simple task. When the U.S. promotes religious freedom, the government has to weigh in on what counts as religion as opposed to tradition or culture or superstition. Religion then requires protection, but superstition does not. It's far too easy in these cases for the religion of the majority or the religion of those who are in power to carry more weight. Again, the U.S. government should tread lightly. We pride ourselves on a long tradition of freedom and disestablishment in this country. Defining religion is not the government's job. This also holds in foreign policy. I'll conclude with 4 brief policy recommendations building on what I've said thus far. First, don't make conflict worse by reducing it to religion. The U.S. should refrain from naming religion or religious difference as the natural or presumed cause of conflict. Religion is always important, but never separable from economic, political, legal, environmental, and other factors. Instead, the U.S. should take a comprehensive approach accounting for economic, social, caste, public health, geographic, gender, educational, and environmental concerns, in addition to religious ones. Second, prioritize justice, equality, and respect for diversity over religious freedom. This does not mean ignoring religion. It does not mean condoning violence. It means directing resources to securing equality, justice, a free market, independent judiciary, environmental security, and the rights of marginalized communities, howsoever defined. Third, work with all local groups and do not privilege religious leaders above others. Religious leaders should be included among representatives of civil society, but not elevated as a special diplomatic class. Finally, depoliticize religion as a gesture of respect and humility. To step back as the government from religion as a focal point is neither to ignore it nor to denigrate it. To respect varieties of religion in social and political life requires the government to tread lightly. Imposing religious freedom abroad does not secure respect for religious diversity and may threaten it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now invite Dr. Susan Hayward, if she could provide her testimony to the commission.
Good afternoon, and thank you to Chairman McGovern and Chairman Smith, to members of the Lantos Commission and to their staff, and to my fellow panelists. My remarks will draw on my experience as a peace builder working worldwide with diverse communities, as well as my research into the religious factors and actors that shape conflict and peace. And these remarks should not be taken to represent the position of my employers, past or present. To begin, I want to acknowledge the concerning rise in religious freedom restrictions worldwide, as has already been cited, and which have been further exacerbated by the pandemic. And I want to underscore the importance of this policy issue and the need to address this trend, as well as to think critically about our past approaches that have seemingly failed to prevent or stem this rise, and how we might adjust our approaches to addressing religious freedom moving forward. And the primary point that I hope to convey today is the importance of integrating a conflict-sensitive approach to religious freedom promotion within a multidimensional diplomatic strategy. I believe passionately that the U.S. must maintain its commitment to protecting the rights of all people at home and abroad to believe and practice their faiths or lack thereof, and not to be discriminated against based on their religious or non-religious identity. And to do so, I suggest that the U.S. must right-size its approach to religious freedom. So I'll elaborate by making 3 points. The first, as did Dr. Hurd, I want to urge a conflict-sensitive approach to religious freedom promotion. Religious freedom violations sometimes, often, occur in a complex context of political and social conflict, and they must be understood and responded to in a manner that is sensitive to conflict dynamics so as not to exacerbate them. In situations of fierce competition, it is not uncommon for political and movement leaders to use religious identity and language to mobilize communities and legitimate violence, to legitimate as well oppressive policies and tactics that bolster their power. As outsiders, when we define and respond through the lens of religious freedom primarily, I fear we may unintentionally reinforce these troubling dynamics in places like Pakistan and Nigeria, contributing to religious power politics. Meanwhile, it may distract us from addressing the salient economic and political interests that are driving violence. Moreover, members of vulnerable religious groups, Muslims in Myanmar, Christians in Iraq, have sometimes conveyed to me that the US's religious freedom rhetoric that emphasizes their persecution at the hands of religious majorities has sometimes unintentionally made them more vulnerable, reinforcing an accusation from their detractors that they are untrustworthy, foreign-influenced operators. This is particularly the case, I think, in post-colonial contexts. The solution is not to ignore the targeting of these groups, of course, but rather to place specific religious freedom issues within the broader context, to better analyze what's taking place and develop a strategic and sensitive response that can promote peace and justice broadly for these vulnerable groups and other vulnerable groups in society. For example, if we interpret the tragic situation faced by Burma's Rohingya Muslims primarily through the lens of religious freedom, we may fail to take account of the military's economic interests in displacement and land grabbing, or how the Rohingya were a tragic casualty of growing and fierce competition between the National League of Democracy and the military that foreshadowed the coming coup. And we create greater competition among ethnic and religious minorities vying for attention and support from the international community, rather than promoting solidarity amongst them so that they might better advocate for a representative democratic government. My second point is that religious freedom cannot be addressed in isolation from other human rights concerns and challenges to democracy more broadly. The rise in religious freedom violations we have seen worldwide accompanies a rise in human rights violations generally and democratic backsliding. And this is no coincidence. An approach to religious freedom that recognizes threats to it as part of larger and interrelated threats to human rights and civil liberties achieves three things. One, it better ensures civic strengthening and democratic pluralism as a broader outcome of religious freedom promotion. Two, it can better address and resolve tensions that may arise between different human rights as they are promoted, for example, between gender equality and religious freedom. And three, it will be more successful, ultimately, in promoting religious freedom than will narrow, isolated strategies that tend to be less sustainable. My third point is that religious minorities face particular and serious vulnerabilities, and we've heard about those today. But I believe it's unhelpful to speak of religious freedom as synonymous with minority rights, much less to focus on particular minority groups over others. Religious freedom and minority rights are overlapping but separate issues, and I worry that our conflation of them has done a disservice to understanding how best to protect all minorities, those religious, racial, and ethnic. Returning again to the Rohingya Muslim community, they are undoubtedly targeted as Muslims, but the challenges they face are also connected to their ethnic identity. Rohingya face different challenges than those of other Muslims in Burma, and they share similarities in their experiences of oppression with other Muslims, as well as with other ethnic minorities, including Buddhist Shan or Rakhine. So the US must not privilege one form of minority identity, religious, over other forms. Our own country's history stands as testament to how racial minority identity renders one no less vulnerable to violence or oppression than does religious minority status. I'm also concerned sometimes when we conflate religious freedom with minority issues, it prevents us from recognizing the needs of those in majority religious communities who are targeted as a result of their particular religious or non-religious beliefs or practices. We must remember that religious freedom is meant to protect all people, all religious minorities who face particular vulnerabilities, as well as those within majority communities who believe and practice outside what's considered orthodoxy, or in ways considered a threat to the social and political order, as well as non-believers seeking freedom from religion. The right to believe and practice extends to LGBT Christians in Uganda, prevented from creating safe worship spaces. It extends to the growing number of atheists in Iraq or those in Bangladesh who are killed after blogging about their beliefs. It extends to young Buddhists in Myanmar who criticize their religious leadership as part of current anti-coup protests and who are then arrested under anti-defamation laws. As I conclude, I want to summarize these points with reference to a particular idea that I believe cogent, the idea of right-sizing, both our understanding of what constitutes religious freedom issues and our approach to addressing them in any given context. This approach urges us not to over nor under emphasize the role of religious ideas and identities, actors, or interests in any context or on any issue. So too, in religious freedom issues, we must right-size our understanding of what religious identity or interests specifically have to do with the violence or oppression that is taking place. We must right-size religious freedom promotion in our diplomatic response by ensuring that we do not address it in isolation from, nor privilege it above, broader challenges to civil liberties and human rights currently taking place worldwide. This, ultimately, I believe, will ensure our greater success in advancing the cause of the freedom of religion or belief. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now invite to provide or give her witness testimony, Guzira Ayelkan, again, a woman who spent more than a year in a camp as a result of being a Muslim, a Kazakhstan Muslim.
Менің атым Гүлзира Өлқан. Мен 2017 жылы шілде айының ортасында қорғас кеген арқылы Қытайға бара жатқанымда Қытай билігі мені ұстап алып Шинжаңның Іле облысы Құлжа ауданындағы Бейсампыл қоныс лагеріне жіберді. Шенеуніктер мені Қазақстанға қоныс аударған және идеясында мәселе бар патриоттық тәрбие, идеологиялық тәрбие және Қытай тілінде білім алу керек деп маған үкім шығарды. Мен 2017 жылдың 1 қарашасына дейін Құлжа аудандық қоныс лагерде болдым. Мен экинчи лагерге ол Кулжа аудандык ана балалар ооруканасына жиберди.
My name is Sergjan Bilash. Let me translate eyewitness Mrs. Gulzira Khan's video testimony. And I'm the founder of Atajurt Kazakh Human Rights Advocacy Group based in Kazakhstan. And my team and I rescued Mrs. Gulzira Khan from Chinese education camps, and Mr. Bob Phu's team and Mr. Bob Phu, China Aid, and Mr. Bob Phu rescued her from Kazakhstan and Turkey. Let me translate it. My name is Gulzira Khan. In the middle of July 2017, passing Horgas customs back into China, CCP authorities arrested and sent me to Xinjiang's concentration camp in Ili Kazakh Autonomous Prefecture, Ining County, Bisampu concentration camp. Officials claimed that I had immigrated to Kazakhstan, had a problem with my thinking, and needed a patriotic education, ideological education, and a Chinese language education. I remained there until November 1st, 2017, when officials transferred me to a second camp, the former location of Ining County Maternal and Child Health Hospital.
Мен 2018 жылы 2 шілдесіне дейін Қытай басшылығы мені бұрынғы Кулжа аудандық 4-ші орта мектебіне ауысқан 3-ші лагерге ауыстырды. Мен мұнда 2018 жылдың 26 тамызына дейін болдым. Халықаралық қоғамдар қып өрганына қысым көрсеткеннен кейін Шинжаң бийлігі тұтқындарды ауыстырды, камераларды алып тастады, бос жерлерді тегістетті, қабырғаларды бізге ақ түске боятты, және мектеп оқушыларына оқуына рұқсат берді.
On July 2nd, 2018, CCP authorities transferred me to a third camp converted from the former Ining County number 4 high school. I remained there until August 26, 2018. After international societies pressured the CCP officials, Xinjiang authorities transferred the inmates, removed the cameras, smoothed out of the empty place, painted the wall white, and permitted the real high school students to study inside the school.
Мен 4-ші орта мектепте жергілікті бийлік жалған топтық сот отырыстарын өткізді. Ол кезде түзету қызметкерлері және менен басқа қамауға алынған адамдарға айыптау сот отырыстарын өткізді. Бақытымызға орай мен 2017 жылдың қарашасында Қазақстандағы күйеуім Тұрсынжан Ектенәлі Алматы облысында орналасқан құқық қорғау Атажұрт ұйымының негізгі қалаушы Серікжан Білашпенен байланысқа шықты. Ол және менің күйеуім Қазақстанда менің құқығымды қорғап, мені қолдай бастады. Сол себепті мен ұзақ жылдық қылмыстық жазаға тартылған жоқпын. Менен басқалар 15-те 20 жылға кесілді. Мен жалпы 6 жерде қоныс лагерде отырдым.
In the number 4 high school, local authorities held sham group trials during which correctional officials conducted a court hearing for me and the other detainees to deal with our charges. Thankfully, in November 2017, my husband reached out to Sergjan Bilash, by document Sergjan Bilash, the founder of the organization Atajurt, a human rights organization based in Almaty, Kazakhstan. He and my husband began to advocate for me, defending my rights in China. Consequently, I didn't receive a long criminal sentences. I was put in 6 different concentration camps before I left China.
Менің сот отырысынан бір күн бұрын маған бийлік және басқа қамауға алынған адамдар Қытай Коммунистік партиясының 75 түрлі саясатын таныстырды, және олар бізді қорқытып, егер мойындасаңдар тез арада босатыласыңдар деп бізді шырғалады. Сол кезде кейбір тұтқындар кінәсін мойындау хаттарына саусақ іздерін басып, олардың астында Қытай тілдерін өз қолдарын қойды. Келесі күні олардың отбасыларды осы тұтқындарды үйге алып кетуге келгенде қып қызметкерлер олардың отбасы мүшелеріне өтірік айтты. Билік оларға ұсталған туыстардың айыптарын мойындағандығын, идеясында мәселе барлығын айтты. Сондықтан оларды басқа лагерлерге алып барып, ойларын түзетуге мүмкіндік беріп жатқанын айтты. Отбасы мүшелері бұл өкімдер туралы білмегендіктен және олармен келісіп, саусақ іздерін келісу құжатына басты. Тұтқындар діни экстремизмді, Қытайға қарсы шетелдік күштермен астасу және тағы басқа қылмыстарменен сотталып кете берді. 2018 жылдың 26 тамызында қып қызметкерлері мені бұрынғы Құлжа ауданы 4-ші орта мектебінен 4-ші лагерге Құлжа ауданында партия құрған Идун лагеріне ауыстырды. Шенеуніктер мені 2018 жылдың 7 қазанында босатты. Шамамен мен босап 10 күн үйде болғаннан кейін билік және мені тағы бір рет күштеп тұтқындап Құлжа аудандағы Жован тоқыма фабрика компаниясына жұмысқа жіберді. Мен онда мәжбүрлі басқа жұмыстар сияқты күн сайын 12 сағат жұмыс істедім. Жұмыстан кейін және 1 сағат саяси Қытай тілін үйрендім.
The day before my trial, authorities revealed the 75 official CCP policies to me and the other detainees. They forced us to choose our own charges. They cajoled us by saying, as long as you plead guilty to the charges, you are free. Some detainees then choose to plead guilty, but their fingerprints on the confessions and signed their names under in Chinese. The next day, when families arrived to take these prisoners home, CCP officials lied to these family members. Authorities told them that their detained relatives had confessed to their charges, and therefore they were being allowed to go to the camps and correct their thinking. As the family members didn't know about the sentences and agreed to them, they marked their fingerprints on consenting documents. Officials charged the prisoners as religious extremist forces colluding with foreign anti-China forces. After then, they sent me to Yili Joan Jafang factory.
Қытай басшылығы мені ұстаған 4 лагердің әрқайсында және оның ішінде дәретхана мен монша бөлмелердің ішінде бақылау камералары болғандықтан менің жеке өміріміздің құпиялығы сақталмады. Түрме бастығы көптеген қатаң ережелерді қабылдады. Соның ішінде бізге моншаға қабылдауға 10 минуттан аз уақыт беріледі. Егер бізге дәретхананы пайдалануға 2 минуттан аз уақыт беріледі. Егер мен немесе басқа қамауға алынған әйел адамдар белгілі уақыттан асырып алса, күзетшілер электр таяқпен басымызға ұратын. Мен 2019 жылдың 30 қаңтарда бас ауыру және жүрек айну салдарынан мен медициналық тексеруден өте бастадым.
As CCP authorities had installed surveillance cameras throughout each of the 4 camps where they detained me, including inside the restrooms and the shower rooms. I and the other had no privacy. Prison officials had adopted a multitude of strict rules, including allowing less than 10 minutes for us to shower. They gave us less than 2 minutes to use the restroom. If I or other detainees spent more time than that, guards hit us on our heads with electric batons. On January 30, 2019, because of ensuing headaches and nausea, I began require medical checkups.
Біздің Қытай лагерінде жаңадан ұстаған кезде бізге 250 юандық тұмауға қарсы тұратын екпе деп бізге мәжбүрлі түрде вакцина салды. Келесі 6 айдың ең нашар кезінде аптасына 2-3 рет менің мұрнымнан қан аға бастады. Сол кезде және басқа кездерде біз ауырып қалсақ, және басқа әйел заттылар ауырып қалса, күзетшілер бізге ұйықтататын дәрі ғана беретін.
In our camp, officers forced the new detainees to take a flu shot that cost 250 Chinese yuan. At its worst, During the following 6 months, I experienced the nosebleeds 2 or 3 times a week during those times, and at others, when we were sick, guards would only give us sleeping pills.
Мен күріш жегенді ұнатпаймын. Оған қарамастан күзетшілер үнемі бізге күріш жеуге мәжбүр етті. Егер біз мойынсұнбасақ, олар бізді азаптап, дәрет-желегін басымызға төгу, жолбарыс орындыққа отырғызу сияқты бізді өте қатты азаптайтын. Мен күрішті жеуге әуестене бастадым. Ал мұны үнемі жемесем, ішім ауыратын болды.
I don't like to eat rice. Nevertheless, guards forced us to routinely eat it. If we disobeyed, they tortured us, forcing us to sit in the tiger chair, a torture instrument like a cooking stool. I considered it strange that I became addicted to eating rice and experienced a stomachache when I didn't eat it regularly.
Психикалық азаптаудан басқа тұтқындар психикалық және рухани азап чеккендер қоныс түрмеде күзетшілер бізді Қытайдың ортақ тілін үйреніп және заңдарын үйретуге, зерттеуге мәжбүр етті. Сондай-ақ бізге Қытай тілінен 3000 әріп жазуды үйретті. Мен Қытай тілі деңгейім өте төмен болатын. Тесулерден талап ететін 80-нен жоғары ғана нөмір алуым керек еді. Мен өте қиынға соғып, рухани жақтан азаптанған соң, ынтам беру уағында біздің қамауға алынған мерзімімізді ұзатады. Егер ынтамнан өте алмасаңдар, уақыттарын ұзатады деп қорқытатын. Біз жауапты жасырын түрде Қытай тіл хаттарын саусағымыздың арасымызға жазып, қағазға көшірген күндері болды. Және күзетшілер оны байқап қалса, тырнақтарымыздың көбісіне ине сұғатын, жолбарыс орындыққа 14-24 сағат отырғызып қоятын. Жанымыз қиналғанда қоярға жер таппай әбден қиналатынбыз.
In addition to physical torture, I and the other prisoners also suffered mentally and spiritually. In the concentration camp, guards forced us to study Mandarin Chinese and the CCP laws. They also ordered us to learn 3,000 Chinese characters. My Chinese language skill, a very basic level, made it super hard for me to pass the test with a required score of 80 and above. As I and the other prisoners feared that officials would extend our detention if we failed the test, we secretly wrote the answers on our fingers. When guards caught us, they inserted needles under our fingernails. The excruciating pain even pierced our hearts.
Күзетшілер бізді жолбарыс орындыққа отыруға мәжбүрлеп жазалаған кезде ауырсыну салдарынан есімізді жоғалтып алсақ, олар есімізді жиғызу үшін бетімізге салқын су шашатын. Содан кейін күзетшілер бізге бақырып шаршаған адам, сен қалай ұйықтауға батылың барады деп тергейтін.
When guards punished us by forcing us to sit in the tiger chair, if we fainted because of the pain, they poured cold water on our heads to shock us back to consciousness. Guards then yelled at us, "We are the ones who are tired. How dare you fall asleep?"
Мен өз көзіммен көрген ең қорқынышты жайттардың бірі Қытай өкіметінің қоныс түрмелеріндегі ішінде жүйелі түрде ұйымдастырған зорлықты жезөкшелік екенін көзім көрді. Мен кішкене бөлмеге барып, мен әйелдерді жуындыруға және де сол жердің моншасын тазалауға жауапты қылды. Мен әйелдердің жылаған дауысын естідім. Оны қатыгез Қытай ер адамдар екенін көрдім.
One of the most horrible things I witnessed firsthand was that the CCP runs a systematically organized forced prostitution system inside the concentration camp. I heard a woman crying after guards sent them into a small room, handcuffed, while Chinese-speaking men raped them. Guards often forced me to shower these women after the cruel men left.
ережелердің ішінде маған ең ауыр болғаны жылауға тыйым салынатын болды. Егер жылайтын болса, қызметкерлердің біздің идеясында мәселе бар, тәртіп түзімге бойсұнбадың деген идеясында қате ойлар бар деп бізді және де 14 сағат бойы жолбарыс орындыққа отырғызып жазалайтын. Немесе бізді басқа бұдан да ауыр қоныс лагерлерге жөткөйтін.
The most painful rule for me, inmates couldn't cry. If we did, officials would consider us infected with wrong or improper thoughts and force us to sit on the tiger chair for 14 hours, or they would transfer us to another camp with even stricter rules.
Билік лагерлері 4 деңгейге бөлінді. Олар мені ең жеңіл лагерде отырсың деп айтты. Міне бұл дұрыс емес, және жасаған кезде лагерге ауыстырған кезде бізді қолымызға көзір салып лагерден лагерге ауыстырып жүрді.
Authorities had split camps into 4 levels. They detained me in the lights. Here, when we did something wrong and when guards transferred us from one building to another, they handcuffed us.
Мен Қытай лагерде тұтқындардың еркіндігі болмайтын. Сақшылар бізді түрмедегі саны 18-ден 60-қа дейін болатын әртүрлі камераларға қамады. 2 қазақтың басын қоспайды, бір камераға орналастырмауға тырысады. Мен әдетте ұйғыр әйелдермен, ұйғыр қыздармен болдым. Олар діни сенімді үшін қамауға алынған шығар деген көзқараста болды. Бірақ мен оларды білмедім. Мен және де 17 ханзу қыздармен бірге болдым. Тіл үйренесің деп мені ол жерге де қамады.
Inmates had no freedom in the camp. Guards put us in various cells where the number of inmates ranged from 18 to 60. As they tried to avoid housing 2 Kazakhs in the same cell, I usually stayed with Uyghurs and also with 17 Han detained for their beliefs. Authorities also possibly held the Christians and the Falun Gong members in this camp. When we were entered the camp, guards cut our new detainees' hair short. After 2 months, for unknown reasons, officials administered a blood test to us.
Мен 2019 жылдың 3 қаңтарында полиция қызметкерлері мені әкемнің үйінен кетіп, Құлжаудан Долан ауылында тергеуге алды. Және олар менің бірнеше құпиялық туралы Қытай лагері туралы айтпауға өтінішке мәжбүрлі түрде қол қойғызып, мені суретке алды, дауысымды тартты да мені Қытай мен Қазақстан арасына орналасқан Қорғас кеденіне жіберді.
On January 3, 2019, police officers transported me from my father's house and they questioned me at Dolan village. After they forced me to sign several confidentially pledges, they sent me to Horgas customs located between China and Kazakhstan. Finally, on January 5, 2019, CCP authorities permitted me to leave China through Horgas customs.
Күзетшілер менің босап кетуім келген кезде жергілікті шенеулік Яң Шипің менен жасырын кездесіп басынан өткізгенім туралы үнсіз қалуымды сұрап, маған 250 мың юан ақша беретінімді және менің Қазақстанға барып айтпауымды ұсынды.
While waiting for guards to free me, a local official, Yang Xinping, secretly met with me and offered me 250,000 Chinese yuan if I would remain quiet about what I experienced. I rejected the money.
Мен ол ақшаны мүлде алмадым, өйткені менің аңсайтыным еркіндікпен Қазақстанға оралғаннан кейін басқаларға не болғанын айтқым келді. Өйткені Қытай коммунистік партиясының Қытай лагерінде ұсталған мен сияқты қаншама әйел аналар бар, қыздар бар, мен сияқты қаншама азаматтардың зардап шеккенін көзіммен көрген, бірақ мен ақшаны алмадым. Егер мен ақшаны алған болсам, еркіндіктен айырылар едім. Ол кезден бастап қорқынышты лагерден қамауда отырғандарды құтқаруға көмектесемін деген үмітпен мен қоныс лагер туралы шындықты айту үшін сапарымды бастадым. Бұл мен үшін бодау беретінді білемін.
As I later told the BBC and other media, I reject the money because What I long for is freedom. When I returned to Kazakhstan, I wanted to let others know what happened because I am not the only one. CCP authorities have detained in concentration camps. Many people like me have been suffering. We all need money, but if I took the money, I would lose freedom. From that time on, with the hope to help save those still detained inside, I began my journey to tell the truth about the horrific concentration camps. I know I will have to pay the price.
Қазіргі уақытта Қытай мен Қазақстан мен үшін және отбасым үшін өте қауіпті.
Currently, neither China nor Kazakhstan is safe for me and my family.
Қазақстанда болғанымда мен Шинжаң лагердегі және кешірмелерім арқылы ондағы сұмдықтарға куәгер болып, халықаралық және бұқаралық ақпарат құралдарынан сұхбаттаса бастадым. Нәтижесінде Қазақстан шенеуніктері физикалық түрде мені қорқытып, менің отбасыма және маған қысым көрсетті. Олар тіпті бізді бөлмеге жалдап тұруымызға кедергі жасады. 2019 жылы Қазақстан полициясы менің ABC-ге берген сұхбатымды бұзып, журналистерді қуып жіберді.
Once in Kazakhstan, I started to accept interviews from international media to share my eyewitness account on my personal experiences in Xinjiang campus. As a result, Kazakhstan officials have physically intimidated as well as pressured my family and me. They even kept us from renting a room. In 2019, Kazakhstan police disrupted my interviews with ABC and drove their journalists away.
Бүгінгі Қытайда біз сияқты аз ұлттарға қарсы қоғамдық шабуылдармен оларды қаралау күн барған сайын күшейе түсті. Мен қиптың қуғын сүргін лагерде қарсы сөйлей бастамастан бұрын Қытай өкіметінің мені жамандауға тырысып, неше түрлі пәле-жалалар менен туыстар арқылы жамандата бастады. Және мені Қытайға қайтарып алуға маған шабуыл жасай бастады. Мен Қытай тактикасының көптеген нақтылы мысалдарын көрдім. Мысалы, Қытай Шинжаңда тыңшылық жасады деп жалған айып тағып, Рақыжанды 13 жылға бас бостандығынан айырған.
Today, public attacks on and the smearing of minorities like us have increasingly become worse in China. Even before I began to speak out against the CCP's persecution camps, I knew the CCP wouldn't only try to discredit me, but they would also retaliate against and fabricate Trump charges against me. I have seen many real-life examples of these tactics. For example, China sentenced Rahjan Zainullah to 13 years in prison in Xinjiang for fabricated charges of espionage.
Қоныс лагерде менің босап шыққаныма қарамастан бостандықтың жалғыз жолы қиптың ықпал күшінен кету, бақылауынан құтылу екенін білдік. Сонымен менің күйеуім Тұрсынжан Есенәлі Серікжан Білашқа көмек сұрады. Ол бізге көмектесіп, халықаралық адамдық қорғау қауымдастықпен байланыстырды. 2020 жылы 23 қыркүйекте Азат Азия радиосы менімен қоныс лагер туралы сұхбаттасып, Шинжаң компаниясының ақштың мәжбүрлі еңбекке жіберуіне байланысты жаңа дәлелдер деген мақаласын жариялады да, өзінің ресурстарын қолдана отырып, және менің отбасымды Қазақстаннан, Түркия, одан кейін Америка Құрама Штаттарынан сәтті құтқарды.
Even though free from concentration camps, the only way to become free was to escape the CCP's control. Knowing this, my husband asked Serikjan Bilash for help. He helped us contact Radio Free Asia and the China Aid Association. On September 23, 2020, Radio Free Asia interviewed me about the concentration camps and published the new evidence further links Xinjiang company sanctioned by US to forced labor. Using its resource, China Aid strategically successfully rescued my family and me from Kazakhstan to Turkey and then to the United States.
Мен 9 ақпанда халықаралық әуежайы және мені қарсы алу үшін Америка Құрама Штаттарының картасын ұстап тұрған Боб және оның қызметкерлері мені отбасымды сол жерден жылы жүзбен қарсы алып қоныс аударуыма көмектескен еді. Мен бұл күнді ешқашан ұмытпаймын. Оларға деген сүйіспеншілігімді және рахметімді айтамын.
I will never forget the day I saw Bob Fu holding the United States map to welcome me at DFW International Airport on February 9, China A, with its church families in Midland, warmly welcomed me and my family and helped us resettle there with their love, support, and the sponsorship. I have vowed to continue to tell the truth to the world, hoping to help save those still detained in concentration camps.
Мен қоныс лагерде қамауда отырғандарды құтқаруға көмектесуге үміт артып, әлемге шындықты айтуға уәде беріп келемін. Қоныс лагерде шамамен 1,5 жыл қызмет ету мәжбүрлі еңбек фабрикасы және маған қорқынышты аяқсыз физикалық және психикалық сондай рухани азаппенен қорқынышты мен Қытай коммунистік партиясының адамгершілікке жатпайтын қатыгез қоныс лагерлерін әшкерелеп, әлемге шындықты айтып бөлісе отырып әртүрлі ақпарат құралдарымен сұхбаттасып, сонымен қатар мен Дежуан Жапан фабрикасы бұрынғы лагерді тұтқында дүниежүзілік нарыққа қолғап тігу үшін азырақ ақша төлегендігін анықтап, босату туралы менің дәлелдерім арқылы және осы басқа түрлі мәжбүрлі еңбек зауыттарының өніміне тыйым салды.
Serving approximately 1 year and a half in 6 concentration camps and a forced labor factory scarred me with horrific, untold physical and the mental as well as spiritual pain and the suffering. I have been interviewed with different media, sharing the truth to the world, exposing the Chinese Communist Party's inhumane, cruel concentration camps. In addition, I revealed that the Zhouwan Jiafang factory paid me and the other camp detainees little to nothing to sew gloves for the global market. In September 2020, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency issued withhold release orders, WROS, and banned the products from this and the other forced labor factories.
Thank you. We do have a few of our witnesses who do have to leave.
Yeah.
We will come back to you.
The last one word.
Алайда мен шындықты жайып салғандығым үшін егер Қытайға немесе Қазақстанға оралатын болсам, ол менің өлімнен басқа жол жоқ екендігін білемін. Сондықтан менің күйеуім Тұрсынжан Есенәлі және біздің қызымыз Баян Тұрсынжан ақш-тан баспана қорғау туралы жазу керек еді. Және Серікжан Біләштің отбасын құтқаруға көмектесулеріңізді сұраймын. Мен ақш конгресіне, ақш өкіметіне және бүкіл халықаралық қауымдастығына жүгінгім келеді. Қазірден бастап мен сияқты қоныс лагердегі жазықсыз әйелдер менен ер адамдарға қарсы геноцидті тоқтату үшін шара қолдануларыңызды сұраймын. Бүгін менімен сұхбаттасқандықтарыңызға рахмет, Гүлзира Өлқан.
Nevertheless, because of my speaking out, if I ever dare to return to China or Kazakhstan, I will surely die. Therefore, my husband, Tursunjan Isenali, and I, our daughter, Bayan Tursunjan, had to file asylum protection in the USA. Also, please rescue Serjan Bilash's family from Kazakhstan. I want to appeal to you, to the United States Congress and the government, as well as the international community. Please act now to stop the CCP's genocide against innocent women and men like me, detained in concentration camps before they become lifeless statistics. Thank you for hearing to me. Serjan Bilash and the Kazakh Human Rights Organization rescued the tens of thousands of innocent detainees from China to Kazakhstan, and Bob rescued me from Kazakhstan to China. So I wish American government rescue Mr. Serjan Bilash's wife. Thank you for hearing me. Gulzira Awelkhan.
Thank you so very much. And Ms. Ayelkhan, words are inadequate to say how sorry all of us feel for the ordeal you have suffered the physical torture, the mental torture at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. So your words not only resonate, but they inspire and they motivate. So thank you so very much for that. Let me also make it clear that the cases you brought up, we will follow up on those, and I thank you for raising those cases and any others to work with the administration to try to find some way of rescue. So I do appreciate that information. I would just say, because I know Mr. Khan has to leave, but if I could ask him a question to start off with regards to Pakistan, obviously. Pakistan was recently designated as a country of particular concern, as you know. I'm wondering, what your advice would be to the Biden administration. It's a very important designation. One of the things we did when we wrote the International Religious Freedom Act, it was Frank Wolf's tremendous accomplishment in 1998. I actually wrote the reauthorization in 2016 and made it clear that the freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is understood to protect theistic and non-theistic beliefs and the right not to profess or practice any religion as well. But we know, as a direct consequence of belief, many governments and organizations, but certainly governments, discriminate horribly. But what most people underappreciate is how much torture is meted out to believers. I got into the religious freedom issue in 1981 when I read Torture for Christ as a new member of Congress, where under the Securitate in Romania, Nicholas Ceausescu routinely, horribly, despicably tortured Christians and other people of faith to just break them, because that's where the opposition comes sometimes, and they wanted everybody to conform to that form of communism. And I know, as you've pointed out, Mr. Khan, if you could speak to what you would advise the administration to do. There's at least 18 prescribed sanctions embedded in the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, and we added to that in 2016. Any particular thoughts that you might want to convey to us and to the president?
Well, I appreciate that very much, Chairman Smith. I also appreciate your leadership on this. I've been following your work on Pakistan and other countries for a long time. I would say this, with respect to the current issues of the extraterritorial reach of the cyber laws, I think this is a concern. The administration needs to look into why essentially the FCC of Pakistan, the PTA, is issuing notices threatening criminal prosecution of foreign citizens. Why is there an extraterritorial reach of these laws on foreign citizens? It's a complete non-starter to go after U.S. citizens to impose criminal blasphemy. The laws are already repugnant, but to do so for people who have nothing to do with Pakistan and content that's literally nothing to do with Pakistan is very disturbing. Number two, I would say that with respect to individuals who harbor hate, who foment hatred and hate crimes and violence and targeted killings of Ahmadis, Christians, and so many other communities, those clerics who are known, who come on TV, they need to be, at minimum, they should not be allowed to travel to the United States. And that's important, that their visas should be restricted to the extent that they foment hatred and violence. They should not, some of them send their children to the United States education system. This is obviously unacceptable, and I think more can be done to pursue that. Of course, there's a panoply of sanctions regimes. I won't comment in the interest of time on all of that, but I would say that in light of the cybercrime escalation, the new digital terrain needs to be looked at very carefully as it pertains to Pakistan.
Thank you so very much for that answer, and we will follow up with you on the particulars as well. I'd like to ask, if I could, Bob Fu, Pastor Fu, years ago, Gao Zhejiang, a human rights lawyer, was arrested. He had defended Christians. He had defended Falun Gong practitioners. And for that, he was singled out for some of the most horrific abuse that the Chinese Communist Party could met out. In 2012, I invited his wife, Gang He, to testify at a China Commission hearing. I chaired the China Commission at the time. And she told us how he was brutally tortured. She said policemen covered his head with a black mask and took him into a room where they stripped him naked and they beat him. They used electric batons to shock him all over his body. This went on and on and on for years. The next year, in 2013, after she had testified in 2012, his daughter, Grace, bravely testified and talked about how the Chinese Communist Party had so harassed their family, made fun of their father, would go with them to school every day and mock them, the children, because of his beliefs as a Christian and because he was a defense attorney, a human rights defender of the noblest kind. If you could speak to this use of torture, we just heard how it's used as part of this genocide by Guzera, and it's ever present, and I think it's grossly underappreciated as to what these people are suffering. And I would say to Bishop Kukah, I, as I mentioned before, had met with Bishop Kegama in Jos, Nigeria. That's when Goodluck Jonathan was the president. And frankly, it was clear that Goodluck Jonathan, even though, there are things happening with Boko Haram, did his level best to have people of all religious persuasions in his cabinet, in his military, and it was, and that has all changed dramatically under Buhari, where the Fulani now dominate virtually everything. And the word you used was unraveled. I went to an IDP camp in northern Nigeria, and met with a number of people who had their homes firebombed and ransacked by Boko Haram because they were Christians. One of them, Habil Abdamnu, told me that an AK-47 was put to his mouth, and he was told, "You renounce your faith or we'll blow your brains out." It was a Boko Haram gunman. There were 3 of them. He says, "I am ready to meet my God," and they blew his face off. Huge, and they left him for dead. When I heard that, I invited him to come to Washington. He testified, and he talked about, again, this profound misunderstanding and underappreciation of the violence that is used by groups like Boko Haram, or in the case of some of these communist dictatorships, against religious believers. He was a man of peace. He harbored no ill will. I was shocked, frankly, inspired too, by his faith. And so, I think that is something that we need. That's why we have an International Religious Freedom Act. That's why we believe that we need to advocate for the defenseless against dictatorships that destroy their lives and their families, and often through forced conversion, forced renunciation of faith, and at the core of it, torture. So if some of you could speak to that, starting with Bob Fu and then Bishop Kukah, then I have a few other questions before I conclude.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for your question. It's a very, very tough one. We all know very well this after arbitrary detention, and especially under the new legal system called the designated surveillance in a designated location. This practice of torture is widely adopted. Not only those human rights lawyers like Gao Zhisheng and 300 some other lawyers, his fellow human rights lawyers and legal activists, since 2015, the July 9th, 2015, many of them who are my friends, like lawyer Li Heping, lawyer Li Chunfu, his biological brother, they were all physically, visibly tortured because after they came out, you can see their faces were even deformed. And we have seen, of course, the religious believers, even those like peaceful mainstream, like the Catholics and Protestants, such as Pastor Wang Yi and the believers in the early Rain Covenant Church, they wrote about their testimonies, and at least more than 50 of them were tortured, and some even developed to suicidal after all these rounds of torture. Some were abused to the year 2020 during the COVID, just because they continued to worship from their own homes. They were taken away, being slapped on their faces, and one torture against a believer in the detention center. Basically, the public security bureau officer would quote one scripture and then slap his face for answer, and then slapped his face again with another part of the scripture for hundreds of times, until he just almost lost the sense. So this is and the most horrible things, that is the organ harvesting among the living human being, and many, we suspect, the Falun Gong practitioners and other death sentenced, already well documented, internationally recognized after the organ harvesting special tribunal chaired by Sir the British, the former Yugoslavia, the prosecutor for the Milosevic. So that is, we are now seeing in Urumqi airport, they have signs with both Uyghur language and Chinese language said organs transportation speed lane. How many organs, that need to be transported every day need a speed lane to get out of the airport. So that's the most fearful thing, as we see really thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands now are in forced disappearance. Who knows where they end up? And many, of course, bishops, the Catholic bishops, also have been disappearing, and we don't know where they are. So this is a very, very widely practice, and so we need to hold them accountable. We need to really continue to find these perpetrators, to sanction them according to the Global Magnitsky Act. So this is practiced very widely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I vote aye. Sorry about that. I'd like Bishop. Do you want to comment on it? We can't hear you, Your Excellency.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, there
Thank you once again, Congressman Smith. The Nigerian situation is a peculiar situation. And what you said about Archbishop Kagama, you can speak about really the Catholic Church and a huge number of other Christian leaders. There is no intrinsic conflict between Christians and Muslims in Nigeria. I've been saying this for the better part of 30 years. What we have in our hands is the instrumentalization of identity. And here, the instrumentalization of the Islamic identity by political leaders. Of course, you might say the same thing about the Christians, but to a lesser degree. And it's not so Muslim political leaders in northern Nigeria, they themselves know that by instrumentalizing religion and using it as a tool for mobilization, they have further deepening the cleavages. And what we have now is a clear case of reaping what we have sown. I left Nigeria yesterday. The Muslim fast has started. You will not believe it. I've been receiving calls, from some of the Muslim imams in Sokoto who are reminding me that it is time for the Muslim fast. I live in Sokoto. I don't feel any threat because I'm a Christian or because I'm a bishop. So at the level of the lives of ordinary people, we are all working together and working as closely as we can. Because like we all keep saying, it's not as if Muslims are having a better life because they've got all the social services and the rest of us don't have them. It is that we are faced with governments that are underperforming, governments that have adopted corruption, inefficiency, and that the reaction that we are facing is largely a reaction is the result of a state that is unable to deliver on its welfare. So going forward, I make the point that this president has made even interreligious dialogue very difficult, in part because of the illusion that has been created that Muslims are in power. The reality of the situation is that, in my view, 80–90% of ordinary Muslims in Nigeria just want to live a decent life, and they're not concerned about who is doing what. So in the final analysis, really, it's a question of governments and President Buhari coming to terms with the fact that the country is falling apart. People are divided. We've never been as divided as we are now. People are dying by the day. The government doesn't seem to be doing anything to rehabilitate them and so on. So these are the issues. And I want to end by simply re-echoing the words of Pope Francis in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, when he says, "Let us dream as a single human family, fellow travelers."
Bishop, we've lost your audio and visual. Can you hear us?
Having me, thank you.
Bishop, we lost you for about 2 minutes of your comments at the end, both audio and visual. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, thank you for. Okay, I don't know at what point you lost me, but I was just making the point that we do not have an intrinsic conflict between Christians and Muslims in Nigeria. As I said, I live in Sokoto, which is like the Vatican of the Muslims. I have very good relationships with the Sultan. I've got good relationships with the governor. We've got good relationships, but we have terribly bad and toxic politics, which has turned Nigerians into victims. Indeed, more Northerners and more Muslims have died in the hands of bandits than if you use the word Christians. But we should be focusing on the fact that our citizens are dying. This is unacceptable. We have said so and we continue to say so. And we are saying that this government has made dialogue very difficult for us because of the perception that the government is loaded in favor of Muslims. But unfortunately, the reality around which people are living is that if you use the word, more Northerners are dying, more Muslims are dying, more Northerners are impoverished, more Muslims are unable to access education. So really, where the Catholic bishops is facing is to insist on our common humanity. And I ended with the quotation from Fratelli Tutti by Pope Francis, the new encyclical by Pope Francis, when he says, "Let us dream as a single human family. Let us dream as fellow travelers of the same flesh, each with his own voice." And I think that politics is about creating space for us to manage and celebrate diversity and difference. But when you close this gap based on ethnicity or on race, you just open the windows for the kind of tragedy that Nigeria is facing. But I believe that we can turn the corner. And this conversation is very important for us because it shows us that people like you and organizations like yours really do care. That means a lot to us. So once again, I really want to thank you very much for the kind invitation extended to us.
Thank you so very much, Bishop Kukah. Jim McGovern, Jim, you still there?
Sheila Jackson.
I know. How about Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee?
I'm here. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, Jim.
Yeah. No. Let me. I just want to. I mean, I'm not sure who's still here, but I want to thank the panelists. And many of them I know. I mean, I've worked with Bob Fu and with Mr. Khan, and I, appreciate their testimony, everybody's testimony here. But here's. I got a couple of questions, and I mean, I've been the co-chair of this commission for many years, and I always struggle with how best to confront the atrocities that we're seeing. I mean, we heard from the chair of USERF that religious freedom is, the situation with regard to religious freedom is worse. It's not getting better globally. And I'm always kind of puzzled why we're not more effective in reversing some of these trends. And Reverend Hayward, I think I can't see on my who's here and who's not, but Reverend Hayward mentioned that narrow strategies for religious freedom promotion do not tend to be sustainable. And maybe you could say a little bit more about what specifically works and what doesn't work to help those being targeted on the ground, based on your experience. And I think you said that U.S. rhetoric on religious freedom sometimes can unintentionally make vulnerable communities more vulnerable. Maybe you could say a little bit more. How do we balance that consideration with the need to raise attention and exert pressure to push governments, with all of us wanting to be successful in reversing some of these horrific trends? I don't know.
I'm still here. Yeah, thank you for the question, Chairman McGovern. And I'll try to answer them as best I can. So with respect to the first question, what do we know are more effective strategies for addressing religious freedom policy? Well, one thing I would say off the bat is that we need more evidence, more evaluation and evidence for what works and what doesn't. We don't have a whole lot of data to show what has been the most effective approach. So a lot of what I'm going to offer here is based on my experiences and what I've seen on the ground and what I've witnessed and where I've seen results myself. And what I would say, reflecting back on what Chairwoman Menza said about how in Syria, when they integrated gender equality and religious freedom approaches together, they found that they were more effective. I think that is also similar to what I've seen in other contexts where religious freedom is integrated in with other human rights concerns. And so you're addressing governance, you're addressing development, you're addressing rule of law issues, corruption, as the bishop was just speaking to in Nigeria, with attention to these questions of equality, including religious freedom, including gender equality, including minority rights generally, with racial and ethnic communities also considered. So it's when you're doing that sort of broader integrated approach to addressing these issues that I think it's like the idiom, a rising tide lifts all boats. You'll end up having both positive effects in terms of some of these religious freedom concerns, as well as corollary effects for other vulnerable communities and for addressing the larger issues of governance or democratic backsliding that often comes part and parcel with these religious freedom issues. I'd also say a couple of things. One, there's always a lot of calls for interfaith dialogue, and I'm both a supporter and a skeptic of interfaith dialogue. I think it's important to create these kinds of forms of cohesion between members of groups, within groups, and between groups. But I've also found that sometimes interfaith dialogue on its own tends to focus on harmony and coexistence and doesn't necessarily get at some of the actual issues of tensions, nor does it connect with real structural issues that are driving violence and oppression. So the degree to which that kind of intergroup cohesion efforts can be integrated with efforts to address some of these structural issues or legal issues that are obstructing the rights of certain communities, I think that will be more effective. And then also I would say that there needs to be patience, that these issues are related to legal norms, social norms, political norms, and that they take time to be able to address. So the kind of sustained attention to it, the kind of integrated approach that looks at how to address these different kinds of norms in these different sectors simultaneously will be more effective. Thank you.
No, I thank you very much. Is Dr. Hurd still on the call here? I don't know.
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay. Thank you all for staying on all this time. I understand that you've been engaged in dialogue with foreign governments on the question of approaches to the protection of freedom of religion. Can you characterize their ideas, concerns, and their recommendations? I'll let you answer that.
Thank you, Representative McGovern. I would say in general, my conversations abroad reflect a division that is internal to foreign governments that I've spoken with. And that division is between, on one side, diplomats who have extensive field experience, a lot of time living in foreign countries and representing whatever country they're representing abroad. And they tend to be very sympathetic to my call for humility and patience and kind of decentering and contextualizing religion as part of a broader field of forces on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you have your religion bureaucracy, as I call them, which, your offices of religious freedom, your religious engagement folks, interfaith dialogue proponents, and so on. And they are more often based in the capitals, and they're more often focused on a particular understanding of religious freedom as a political project, as a legal aim and objective that should then be put on and kind of enforced or imposed and kind of made real, like it or not. A much more muscular project than the others who tend to be a little bit suspicious of any effort to sort of force religious freedom through the law. And so the diplomats are much more wary of these kind of impositions of religious freedom and the prioritization of religious identity, because precisely, as we've heard, they have seen firsthand the very divisive effects of these policies on the ground. Many officials see things in more black and white terms, and we have to, I think, be very, very cautious. In the EU, I've often heard it said that even if U.S. advocacy for religious freedom is kind of ham-handed and often preferential toward Christians, that the Europeans are going to do it better, that they're going to do religious freedom 2.0, and they're going to best us, and they're going to reinvent it, and they're not going to make all the mistakes that we've made by politicizing it. I don't agree with them, actually. They expect me to, but I don't. I don't think that they're right. I think that their triumphalist versions of religious freedom are just as dangerous as are ours. Thank you for your question.
No, I appreciate that. And, the testimonies that we've heard today identify examples of government laws and policies that specifically target people who hold certain religious beliefs. And this seems to be the case for the Uyghurs in China, the Ahmadiyya community in Pakistan, and the Baha'i community in Iran. What's the best way for the U.S. government to act on its disagreements with these kinds of laws and policies?
Yes, thank you. So I have to say that I think that the answer is going to be very context dependent. In the case of the Rohingya, which has come up again and again, what we need to be wary of, and what the U.S. needs to be wary of, is reinforcing the hard and fast lines that are dividing Muslims from Buddhists in that particular context. Why do we need to be careful? Because those are the very same lines that the most violent Burmese extremists, including elements of the state itself, are relying on in order to propagate the violence. So what happens is, if we prioritize religion and we lift it above all other factors in this complex force field, we are inadvertently and sadly reinforcing a violent form of Buddhist nationalism that seeks to rid Burma of Muslims altogether. So what we want to do is sap those forces rather than embolden them. And when we politicize religious identity, unfortunately, we're strengthening them. So U.S. policymakers in these contexts need to go to the ground and talk to people involved in the conflicts and then ask, are these individuals being killed because of their religion, because they're seen as immigrants, because they're seen as outsiders, because of their gender or sexuality, because they're perceived as threatening political or economic interests of those in power, or all of the above? And until we ask those precise and difficult questions about each and every context, rushing in with religious freedom as the prescription and the solution to all that ails us, I think is going to create more problems than it resolves, unfortunately.
Thank you. And I have one more question for Mr. Fu. And then I know people have been here for a long time, so I'm going to ask, I will probably submit some questions in writing to individuals. But Bob Fu, I think you're still on the, I'm assuming you're still on the.
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, yeah. Let me ask you a question. What is your analysis or evaluation of the agreement reached between the Vatican and the PRC government regarding the naming of bishops?
Thank you, Chairman McGovern. First of all, sorry that the other computer or the other witness from Ms. Guzera and her translator, Sarah Kujan, they're off. So they came to my room. I hope you can forgive us. Yes, so that Vatican Chinese Communist Party secret agreement, by far the letter of the agreement was not fully revealed yet, is proven as a grave mistake, because they announced the intention from the Vatican side was, this will bring the underground independent Vatican appointee of the bishops and other clergymen to have unity with the above ground, the Communist Party appointed bishops and the clergymen and their members. But it turns out it gave the Xi Jinping actually a better, more clear list of persecution. Those who used to be more independent now either forced out or they were basically having to sign a particular patriotic statement to be integrated with this so-called Sinicization campaign. And if you don't do that, we have already have seen, those from bishops to the fathers, the nuns were being arrested, and in a very systematic way. So it certainly destroyed what the Vatican had hoped. And the other irony was, the core conflict between Vatican and China was the authority. Who has the final ultimate authority to appoint bishops and other clergymen? Is that the religious, authority, the Vatican, the Pope, or is the Communist Party? This so-called agreement actually gave the Chinese Communist Party a veto power, basically to filter candidates first.
Right.
Who would have thought, the Communist Party would have their religious criterion to submit names to Vatican for approval, right?
Yeah.
So this is a grave mistake.
Well, you should know that early on, Speaker Pelosi, myself, and the former co-chair of this commission, Frank Wolf, actually met with the office of the Papal Nuncio here in Washington to express our concern over that. Let me just ask you one last thing, and then I will yield back. In your testimony, you say that the CCP persecuted more than 1 million people in 2018, 3.5 times more than researchers recorded in 2017. Is this all people across all categories of human rights violation, or is it just for religious freedom reasons, or is it just Christians? How does your methodology define persecuted?
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, to ask that question. So that was the characterization of only the Protestant Christian community alone, the 1 million. I used the Christian community, the persecution Christian community as an example in my testimony, in the beginning of my testimony. Maybe I did not write it clearly later on. That it was specifically that we as a NGO using whatever we have, the resources on the ground in China, that documented that we know this number of people in different churches, in the around different provinces in China, who are persecuted. By persecuted, we mean that when they are worshiping together, they were raided. Not necessarily all of them were taken into custody, but absolutely, those 1 million number that estimated, they are already affected when they were, read by the public security officers. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. And again, I want to thank all the panelists, and I'll yield back to Mr. Smith.
Very much, Chairman. I understand that Ms. Jackson Lee is still on. I would like to ask a few questions.
Let me thank the witnesses for their presence here today. I particularly want to acknowledge Dr. Ahmad Khan, who I understand had to leave at 4:30. I was trying to be recognized in order to ask him questions. He is from Houston, Texas, and has acknowledged some of the travesties that the Ahmadiyya Muslim community has experienced. First of all, I want to thank the community for their enormous charitable work that they've done, working with all of us during the time of our natural disasters. They've been a very active community in Houston and around the nation. So I think his presence obviously recognizes that there is no distinction among the violence that can occur because of your particular religious belief, your particular aspect of religion as well. I want to start with Reverend Hayward in terms of both your academic prowess and, of course, with Harvard Divinity School's Religion and Public Life program, to explain that or to indicate that the hostility of religious bias can be as deadly and as devastating as race discrimination, sex discrimination, discrimination because of age or disability, because of region, conflicts in war, because of fights between countries. How deeply impacting is religious discrimination? Reverend Hayward?
I agree entirely, Representative Lee, and thank you for the question. That forms of discrimination that are justified on and driven by religious difference or religious justification can be just as insidious as other forms of discrimination and violence that are based on identity. What I was calling for, I was not saying that that is not the case. What I was saying is that we need to understand the forms of discrimination that different groups face based on their identity as often driven by similar kinds of causes of oppression, of power politics, and need to be addressed in similar kinds of ways. So what I was concerned about was sort of prioritizing one form of discrimination, namely religious discrimination, over racial discrimination or over gender discrimination or violence. Rather, I think that they need to be addressed on equal footing, and that by addressing them on equal footing in an integrated way, you're often addressing similar kinds of drivers. So what drives forms of violence that oppresses religious minority groups, for example, are often the same kinds of factors that drive violence against LGBT communities, for example. And so recognizing that helps us to create an approach that is going to be more strategic and sensitive. But I spent my career at USIP, and I continue to now here at Harvard, understanding just how insidious forms of violence and discrimination that are framed within, justified within religion can be. And part of what I seek to do now in this program is develop what's called religious literacy, which is about understanding what religion has to do with it and what it doesn't have to do with it, where religion is the frame for various forms of political power dynamics or economic interests and so on that are justified or framed within religion. And helping to understand that can then help you better understand the context and develop the context-specific responses. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go, Professor Hurd, just build on my comments, but I'm going to expand a little bit because I wanted to draw from Professor Hayward I think she ended on the insidiousness of religious discrimination. But obviously, as an African American woman, I don't want the question of race to be diminished. I'm reading a book called Caste, who happens to be, I think, a Harvard professor, and it is devastating, which leads me to say that the premise for HR 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals, is enormous. And I'm glad to have such a wide breadth of support from my colleagues in the United States Congress. But let me, since I'm going to go to the bishop next on the question of the issues in Nigeria, but let me see how we can diminish none of that, meaning the heinousness of race, the brutality of slavery, the continuing sort of response to that. But then as we look to today in the world, I think that's one of the things that I wanted to emphasize of religious domination, religious discrimination, and religious violence. Where are we today in the world?
Thank you so much, Representative Jackson Lee. You know, I think that I would just probably want to build off what Reverend Hayward was saying in her comments and suggesting that as we sit here with our focus on questions of persecution, discrimination, and violence, we are, the Reverend and I, calling for a certain kind of broadening of our lens so that we are not laser-like focused on religion and religious difference, but rather we're focusing on cooperation, conflict, coexistence as human beings. And I think that allows us to see a slightly bigger picture, to have a broader canvas, and to understand some of the factors and the forces and the institutions and traditions that can be co-opted by very powerful states, for example, and then used against minority communities of all different kinds, racialized minorities, religious minorities, minorities that are defined in ethnic terms. The list goes on, unfortunately. And so what we're calling for is not to ignore or to push religion aside or to put it in the margins by any stretch of the imagination, but rather to understand it as woven into the tapestry of human social affairs, into our laws, into our customs, into our ways of being, and trying to then understand better how those various dynamics can, in some circumstances, lead to violent outcomes and to prevent them. So I hope that addresses your concerns, and I thank you very much for your interest in this topic.
Thank you. I think this, brings us to a long discussion. Let me raise a question with, and thank you for that, with Bishop, thanking him for his presentation. Bishop, let me pursue, I chair and the co-chair of the Nigerian caucus, and I hope that I'm still on. Is the WebEx still working? Looks as if Bishop, in Nigeria.
Yeah, I'm here. I can hear you.
All right, very good. I couldn't tell whether you could or not. Let's focus on I'm sad to see this democracy be where it is. Nigeria in particular, I'm talking about, with such potential, such wealth. So let me focus on Christianity, expand even beyond Catholicism, and tell me what the depth of crucifixion almost is in the northern area as relates to the Christian faith. The beheading, the burning, the various attacks on people of a different faith. What do you think the cause of it is? What is the solution to it?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the good work you're doing for Nigeria. Let me say it's a very difficult question, but I think the first thing to say is that what is happening in Nigeria does not represent Islam, does not represent the Muslim community, as I already said. What is happening is a strain within Islam. That is the Salafist brand of Islam that believes that the only practitioners of Islam are those who believe what they believe and how they believe. Let me also say that there are members of the Muslim community have equally been targets of the same attacks that the country has faced. So, and that is why I make the point that we must do everything we can to avoid falling into the trap of thinking that we are faced with an existential threat of a conflict or an inevitable conflict between Christians and Muslims. Because indeed, like I said, Muslims, if you use that expression, and Northerners have suffered disproportionately. And the point I make and continue to make, and I think the average Nigerian knows, and even the Muslim politicians in northern Nigeria know, that they, more than any other group, have laid the foundation for the problems that we are facing now. First, if you remember, the whole of northern Nigeria, or the areas that are contiguous with the violence, or coterminous with the areas of bloodshedding and bloodletting and violence, are the areas that are coterminous with those areas that were declared Sharia, who enforce Sharia law beginning from the year 2000. Now, that laid the foundation and opened the window for these elements that have now infiltrated Nigeria and are holding the religion hostage and holding the entire country hostage. And I also have made the point that the way President Buhari has handled religious identity in managing our diversity has further exacerbated and deepened the fault lines of conflict. And so it's what we are witnessing has depth, but I think the reality is that on a day-to-day basis, there is hardly any Nigerian that is not saddened by the tragedy that we now are living with. That is, you can take that to the bank. Now, the processes of reconstruction or rebuilding our confidence, this is what, as I said, the Bishops' Conference, the Christian Association of Nigeria, the Supreme Council for Islamic Affairs, and other religious groups are working very hard on. But the truth of the matter is that no matter how hard we labor on this project, the body language of the President of Nigeria has to be such that it sends out a signal that every citizen of Nigeria is important. We have not seen that happen. Nigerians are saddened by the fact that, as I said, the President of Nigeria will spend such huge resources, running into billions of dollars, to construct a railway line to another country, when the citizens of the country that he's living in are dying, when people are not able to feed, when there are visible threats to the corporate existence of the country. Now, I also have made the point that mostly, if you use religion, the North itself and Muslims have suffered perhaps more than other groups in this tragedy that has afflicted the country. So for us to move forward, the president's body language has to suggest that he is interested in holding our country together. We've never been as divided as we are now. We've never been as vulnerable as we are now. And yet his election laid the foundation for what Nigerians thought was going to be an opportunity for us to get past all the things that have held us down. Divisions based on region, divisions based on religion, and other categories. Now, I think that moving forward, we must continue on the path of dialogue. We must also accept the fact that all of us across the board are literally the walking wounded, because there is no community that has not been affected negatively by what we are facing in Nigeria. So to make it a Christian-Muslim problem doesn't get to the roots of the problem that we are facing. So fact of the matter is that even those who say they want to leave Nigeria, as you hear every day, people have become frustrated because they cannot find a seat at the table. There is a feeling that somehow, like the president says, I mean, a group of people say they are unhappy, and you say that they are just a dot in a cycle. Now, these are some of the difficulties that have led us to where we are. So can we recover? Yes, we can recover, because you refer to a crucifixion. Well, there was a resurrection after the crucifixion. I'm personally very convinced that Nigeria will turn the corner. We have the capacity, we have the resources, we have the goodwill, and initiatives and platforms of this nature only give us greater confidence. So please, I appeal to you, continue to hold our hand and encourage us, because where Nigeria goes, that's where Africa will go. 1 out of every 5 Black people in the world is a Nigerian. And this president, for example, has done exceptionally well for Nigeria. The fact that there are 8 members who are holding key positions in the Biden administration, in my view, it is a signal of the possibilities that about what our country can be. So we are relentless, and we are really committed to turning the corner and hopefully putting the problems of religion behind us, because we have the resources, both in manpower and in other ways. It's just a question of the political class coming to terms with the realities of what democracy is all about.
Bishop and Sheila, I think we lost both of you. I don't know if the others have lost you as well.
Hear me now? Sorry.
Yes. Now
thank you very much. I just want to make sure you were not saying President Buhari was the reason for members of the Nigerian American community being in the Biden administration. That's not what you're saying, is it?
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm actually saying is that the very fact that we have this number of people of Nigerian descent at the table is an opportunity for Nigeria. Okay, so I'm not saying that the appointments have been made because of President Buhari. No, I'm saying that the appointments have been made. I think that it should even be a signal of how seriously this administration takes our country. So I'm just saying it's a window.
Now I understand, Bishop.
It's a window that I think we should try and take advantage of.
Yeah, no, I understand. I just wanted to make sure, because I'm not happy with President Buhari as you have described the circumstances there. I think you have articulated them, and I think I was muted when I said I have the largest Nigerian American population in my area, which is Houston, Texas. I do think that it is important and that we need to give you support for the fact that Muslims and Christians are sitting down together in Nigeria. That should be known around Africa, around the world, and in the United States. And you're right, well-placed Nigerian Americans who are prominent in every aspect of our society and who have religious freedom here in the United States can be very instrumental in trying to get this great nation back on its footing. And I too, being a student of Nigeria, having studied in Nigeria at Ibadan and Lagos at the universities, I too understand that the way the elections are supposed to be is a Christian, a Muslim, a Christian, a Muslim, and that the government should be integrated. It seems like that is not the case now. So it impacts on how religion is treated. And I just simply want to be promoting democracy and religious freedom and freedom of people of different ethnicities or tribal affiliations. I think that is very important. That is a question in Nigeria that we need to confront for it to meet its promise. That's my true belief at this time. So thank you very much, Bishop, for enlightening us. I do am saddened by what is happening in northern Nigeria through Boko Haram. You're right, it's not Muslims. It is if you will, a destroying of the Muslim faith in terms of how Boko Haram uses it for violence. So I thank you very much. I want to let Ms. Gulazira know that her story was very, very moving, and we want to make sure that we are able to be of help. Just if I can ask one very short question to her, and that is about why China would want to attack a minority like hers, as having done nothing to undermine the country. Why would China want to attack a community that just wants to be free?
Let me answer this, because News'un sayılar östüp adamlar dostlar.
Медиасында мәселе бар деп сөйтеді. Алсамдылықтарды не қылу ғой, қытайластыру, жеп айтқанда. Тіл мен дінін жойып қытайластыру.
Hello, let me translate Mrs. Gulzira's answer, and it is answer from me, because we worked the last 5 years and collecting more than 30,000 video testimonies about Chinese re-education camps in Xinjiang, China. And I'm the founder of that human rights organization and the leader of that organization. And all these facts which we collected the last 5 years, and it shows that it is genocide. The Chinese government went to determine and assimilate all this ethnic minority, include the Kazakhs and the Uyghurs in Xinjiang region, and they went to determine all the ethnic minorities. That's their aim. That's their goal. We collected more than 30,000 video testimonies about Chinese re-education camps last 5 years, because Kazakhstan has almost 500,000 Kazakhs born at China and immigrated to Kazakhstan last 30 years after Soviet Union collapsed and the Kazakhstan get independent. All this 500,000 Kazakhs is originally from China, and all of them has family members and loved ones in Xinjiang, China. And this 500,000 Kazakhs offered us around 30,000 video testimonies, and it is our base and it is our key to expose the Chinese re-education camps and the Chinese genocide in Xinjiang, China. We are the first team in the world exposing Chinese genocide and the Chinese re-education camps in Xinjiang, China. So we call it genocide.
Thank you so very much, Chairman Plural. Thank you for, again, another very important hearing, and hopefully we can generate some legislation that to build upon your work, Chairman Smith, Chairman McGovern, that I know has been ongoing. It looks like the final point I want to make, it looks like 2021, we're still confronting stark conditions of religious violations of religious freedom, and that it is happening around the world. And I think that is really something that does not in any way diminish or in any way compete with the intensity of racial discrimination and the question that we've been dealing with here in the United States is the impact of slavery and of course HR 40. But it certainly says that in our current day, people around the world are facing religious violence, religious discrimination, something very important that we should address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. Let me, to your point, and I think it was a good point, and the Bishop focused on it as well, that President Buhari, unlike Goodluck Jonathan, who had Christians as well as people who are of the Muslim faith, Buhari in recent years has just basically put Fulanis in the key positions: National Security Advisor, Chief of Staff, Inspector General of the Police, Head of the Drug Enforcement Agency, Minister of Police Affairs, Minister of Justice, Finance, Education, and Ag, the heads of National Petroleum Corporation, the Federal Inland Revenue Services, the chief of the Army staff, more than 30 key positions at the highest level. And I remember on trips when Goodluck Jonathan was president, there was such diversity, and you had, people both in the parliament and the Congress, I should say, who had high positions who were of both faiths. And it did make a huge difference in terms of how issues were perceived when they were in closed doors, and that's not there anymore. So that's a very serious problem. I would like to ask, if you could.
Thank you.
Mr. Vance, human rights were not included in negotiations, as we all know, on the Iranian nuclear deal. And many of us argued, I actually chaired hearings where I asked the administration to include human rights. We made that mistake with North Korea. And when there was no fruit borne there with regards to the nuclear talks, there was no human rights progress either. And I'm just wondering if you could just speak to the issue of whether or not you would hope that if talks were to resume, if the Baha'i and other repressed religious minorities should be your cause voiced at the table, and how well or poorly has, like, the UN Human Rights Council and others at the UN responded to the draconian measures taken against the Baha'i, which many of us have spoken to. Many years you've led on it, and thank you for that. But it's really such a peaceful and peace-loving group of people to find themselves targeted for persecution. Has the UN been helpful either?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, of course, in any negotiations, in any relationships with the Iranian government, whether it's the nuclear deal or any other issues, the Baha'i community would certainly hope that human rights would be part of the discussion, for the obvious reason that it's such a serious problem. And there are so many groups, including, of course, the Baha'is, who are suffering so badly as a result of the actions of the Iranian government. With respect to the UN Human Rights Council, the special rapporteurs for freedom of religion and belief have done, in our view, an outstanding job over the last several years of highlighting and documenting and investigating the situation of religious freedom in Iran, and have brought to the attention of the Council the situation. And in fact, you're probably already aware of the fact that the voting in the Human Rights Council for the renewal of the mandate of the special rapporteur has been strongly in favor of the renewal of that mandate. And in the UN General Assembly each fall, the General Assembly's resolution on Iran has continued to gain the same kind of strong support that it has had in the past. So, and that's in large part due to the work, I think, of the Special Rapporteur and other UN agencies, but certainly the Special Rapporteur. Finally, the Universal Periodic Review that's conducted every 4 years has been very, very important in highlighting the kinds of things that the Iranian government has to do. And it has been pursued by the Special Rapporteur as a document, to measure the progress of the regime.
Mr. Vance, I would like to thank all of our witnesses for your generous time you've given us today, and for your talent and insights. Really do appreciate it. And I'd like to just close by thanking the people that you're representing, the ones that are, like in your case, Mr. Vance, the wonderful Baha'i believers. I mean, they just suffer so much. The Uyghurs, which I've gotten to know many. I met Rabia Kadir when she was first let out of prison, and she came to this office, and I held a hearing with her. Her family has been, I mean, this is something we don't focus on enough, but what the Chinese Communist Party is doing is arresting not just individuals, but their entire families, in-laws, and right on through. to make a terrible, statement of we can destroy you, and they are doing just that. So my hope is that all of us will redouble our efforts to protect the defenseless and the disenfranchised. And having said that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.